Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight, a quick and sincere thank you to Beneo for suggesting this story. This one has been sitting in the back of our minds for weeks now, and it turned out to be one of the strangest, most tangled threads we've ever pulled on. So Beneo, this episode belongs to you. Now settle in, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Tonight we're going high into the Andes, into thin, cold air and thinner political ground, into a country that for 11 months in the early 1970s became the most closely watched place on the South American continent. Not because of its size, not because of its army, but because of what it might prove. This is the story of Bolivia, and of a general who believed his country could choose a third path, and of the possibility, still argued over by historians and archivists and men who kept their mouths shut for 40 years, that his removal was not an accident of history at all, that it was a rehearsal. This is the Condor Directive. There is a particular quality to the air in La Paz that visitors never forget. The city sits in a bowl carved into the Altiplano, more than 11,000 feet above the sea, and the sky above it is a blue so deep it seems almost purple at the edges. Breathing takes effort. Newcomers walk slowly, pause on staircases, feel their hearts working. There is an old joke among diplomats posted to Bolivia that the altitude does something to a man's judgment, that decisions made in La Paz would never be made at sea level. In October of 1970, a soldier named Juan José Torres González climbed the steps of the Palacio Quemado, the burned palace, and became the president of Bolivia. He was 49 years old. He had a broad face and heavy eyebrows and the slightly weary bearing of a man who had spent his entire adult life inside an institution he was no longer sure he believed in. He had come up through the army the way most Bolivian officers did, through provincial garrisons and staff colleges, and the endless internal politics of a military that had been the true government of the country, on and off for decades. But something had shifted in him. Somewhere in the long, grinding years of the 1960s, watching the mines and watching the miners and watching what happened to the miners, Juan José Torres had stopped being the kind of officer Washington found comfortable. He arrived in power not through an election, but through a fracture. That is worth saying plainly, because it matters to everything that follows. Bolivia in 1970 was not a stable constitutional democracy interrupted by a coup. It was a country in continuous political motion, where governments rose and fell in a matter of months, where the army was a political party with tanks, where the Tin Miners Federation could shut down the national economy with a single vote and knew it. The previous president, General Alfredo Ovando Candia, had come to power himself through a coup and had governed with a peculiar mix of nationalism and hesitation. He had nationalised the holdings of an American oil company, which made him enemies abroad, and then had lost his nerve on almost everything else, which made him enemies at home. By October of 1970, his government was collapsing under its own contradictions. What happened next was not one coup, but 3, tangled together over about 48 hours. A group of hardline right-wing officers moved first, seizing the palace and declaring a military junta. They expected the rest of the armed forces to fall in line behind them. As had always happened before, it did not happen. Instead, something extraordinary occurred. The Tin Miners Federation announced a general strike. The Labour Confederation called workers into the streets. University students occupied campuses across the country. And crucially, elements of the Air Force refused to recognise the junta, moving instead to support Juan José Torres, who had positioned himself as the officer willing to govern with the left rather than against it. For a few hours, La Paz held its breath. Then the junta calculated the arithmetic of a civil war it could not win, and folded. Juan José Torres walked into the palace, carried by an alliance that had almost no precedent in Bolivian history. Miners, students, labour organisers, junior officers, leftist intellectuals who had spent years in and out of prison. A coalition of people who agreed on very little except that the old arrangement had failed them. He stood on the balcony and looked out at a crowd that was cheering for a general. Think about that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. A crowd of miners and students cheering for a man in a uniform in 1970 in Latin America. It was, depending on who you ask, either a beautiful anomaly or a warning sign that something had come badly loose. The new president began to govern almost immediately, and he governed fast. He raised wages for the miners, whose conditions in the Bolivian tin mines were among the harshest industrial labour conditions anywhere on Earth. Men worked in tunnels where the temperature swung from freezing to suffocating within a few hundred metres. Silicosis killed them young. The average working life of a Bolivian miner underground was measured in a small number of years before the lungs gave out. He restored control of the mining complex at Matilda to the state. He expelled the Peace Corps, arguing that its programs in rural communities amounted to a foreign presence in Bolivian villages that Bolivia had not properly consented to. He allowed exiles to return. He reduced restrictions on the press. He opened relations more warmly with the socialist world, accepting offers of technical cooperation and equipment that had previously been unthinkable. And then he did the thing that alarmed people most. He allowed the creation of what became known as the Assemblea Popular, the Popular Assembly. It convened in the spring of 1971 in the very chamber where the Bolivian Congress normally sat. But this was not a Congress. Its delegates were not elected by geographic district. They were sent by unions, by the Miners' Federation, by peasant organisations, by student groups, by the political parties of the left. It had no formal constitutional authority. It could not pass binding law. It was in strict legal terms a debating society. But its critics did not see a debating society. They saw a parallel government. They saw, in the phrase that began circulating in Bolivian officers' clubs and in cables leaving the American embassy, a Soviet, a workers' council. The same institutional form that had appeared in Petrograd in 1917, in Germany in 1918, in every place where the old order had been about to fall. Whether the comparison was fair is something historians still debate. The Popular Assembly was chaotic, factional, and largely powerless. It spent much of its brief existence arguing with itself. Delegates from rival Marxist tendencies could not agree on procedure, let alone strategy. Torres himself kept a careful distance from it, and by some accounts privately found it more of a burden than a resource. But perception is the engine of history, and the perception in certain rooms was absolute. Bolivia was building a workers' state. Bolivia had a president who would not stop it. Bolivia sat on top of enormous mineral wealth and shared a long border with Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Paraguay. And Bolivia had, only 3 years earlier, been the country where Ernesto Guevara had tried to ignite a continental revolution and had been shot in a schoolhouse for the attempt. The soil was thought to be receptive. That was the fear. Let me tell you about the ghost in this story, because he is present in every room even though he had been dead for 3 years. In 1967, Che Guevara had come to Bolivia. He had chosen it deliberately, believing that its position at the geographic heart of South America made it the ideal place to begin a hemispheric insurgency. He brought a small column of fighters into the rough country near Nyancahuazu and waited for the Bolivian peasantry to rise. They did not rise. The campaign was a disaster almost from the beginning. The local population was suspicious of the outsiders. The Bolivian Communist Party refused to support the operation. Supply lines failed. Guevara's asthma tormented him, and a Bolivian Ranger battalion, trained and equipped with American assistance, hunted the column through the ravines until it was destroyed. Guevara was captured on the 8th of October 1967 and executed the following day in the village of La Higuera. A young Bolivian sergeant pulled the trigger. An American intelligence officer of Cuban origin was present in the village, a man named Felix Rodriguez, who took the dead man's Rolex and would carry it for years afterward. Now here is why this matters. The officer who commanded the Bolivian armed forces during that campaign, who oversaw the operation that killed Guevara, was Alfredo Ovando, and the officer serving as chief of staff, the man in the room for those decisions, was Juan José Torres, the same Juan José Torres who, 3 years later, would be carried into the presidential palace by cheering miners and would open his government to the Bolivian left. Understand what that looks like from the outside. Understand what it looks like in a Washington briefing room. The man who helped hunt down Che Guevara is now governing with Guevara's ideological descendants. If Bolivia could turn a counterinsurgency general into a socialist president, what exactly was solid anymore? What was reliable? Who could be counted on? That question is the seed of everything that follows. The 1971 that Torres inhabited was not a quiet year anywhere. In Chile, Salvador Allende had been inaugurated as president in November of 1970, the first Marxist in the world elected to lead a country in a free multi-party vote. He was already moving to nationalise copper. The Nixon administration's hostility toward Allende is not conspiracy theory. It is documented, declassified, and admitted. There are memoranda. There are transcripts. There is a famous handwritten note by the Director of Central Intelligence recording an instruction to make the Chilean economy scream. In Peru, a military government under Juan Velasco Alvarado had seized power and, contrary to every expectation, had turned sharply left, nationalising oil and launching sweeping land reform. In Argentina, the military government was losing control of the streets. In Uruguay, an urban guerrilla movement was humiliating the state. In Brazil, a hard military dictatorship had settled into place and was already exporting its methods to its neighbours. The continent was in motion, and in the calculus of the Cold War, motion was danger. So when American officials looked at a map of South America in early 1971, they saw something that made their hands cold. Chile with Allende in the presidential palace, Peru with a leftist junta, Bolivia with Torres and his popular assembly. 3 contiguous countries running down the spine of the Andes, all drifting in the same direction at the same time. A corridor. That was the word that appeared in Analysis. A corridor of leftist governments from the Pacific coast into the heart of the continent. Whether anyone said the word out loud in the Situation Room is unknown, but it was in the air, and the air was thin, and decisions were being made. Let us go to Washington now. Let the Andes fade for a moment. Let the thin air become the recycled air of a windowless basement room beneath the West Wing. The Situation Room in 1971 was not the polished television set that people imagine. It was cramped and low-ceilinged and had the faintly institutional smell of old carpet and stale coffee. It had been built after the Bay of Pigs, when it became clear that the president needed a place where information could be gathered and acted upon quickly. It was, in a sense, a room built out of an earlier failure in Latin America. The men who gathered there in the early months of 1971 had a particular way of thinking about the world. It was a way of thinking shaped by the Second World War, by the fall of China, by Korea, by Cuba, and by the long humiliation that was then unfolding in Vietnam. It held that the world was a board, and the board had squares, and every square that changed colour changed the shape of everything around it. Richard Nixon was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who worked with him, a man of enormous political intelligence and profound personal insecurity, and Latin America occupied a strange place in his psychology. In 1958, as vice president, he had toured South America on a goodwill trip that had gone catastrophically wrong. In Lima he was spat upon. In Caracas his motorcade was surrounded by a mob that shattered the windows of his car and rocked it back and forth while he sat inside. He had genuinely feared for his life. He never forgot it. Some who knew him believed that everything he later did in the hemisphere carried the shadow of that afternoon in Caracas. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, brought a different set of instincts. Kissinger's frame was European, balance of power, 19th century in its bones. He was famously dismissive of the region, and one of his remarks about it has become notorious among historians, an offhand comment about a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. Whether the exact phrasing is accurate is disputed. The attitude behind it is not. Into that room, according to the conspiracy, came an intelligence assessment on Bolivia. Now, the existence of intelligence assessments on Bolivia is not in question. They existed. Some have been declassified. They discuss Torres's coalition, the strength of the labour movement, the reliability of various officers, the state of the economy. They are the ordinary product of an intelligence apparatus doing its ordinary work. But the conspiracy claims that one particular assessment, delivered in the spring of 1971, went further, that it did not simply describe, that it recommended. The document in this telling ran to a small number of pages and was distributed to a very short list. It argued that the Torres government represented a categorically different threat than Allende's Chile. Its reasoning was this: Allende was constrained. He had won a plurality, not a majority. He faced a hostile Congress, an independent judiciary, a press that could criticise him, and a military with a strong constitutionalist tradition. Chile had institutions that would push back. Chile could be squeezed from within by its own machinery. Bolivia had no such machinery. Torres had no Congress to obstruct him. He had no constitutional term to run out. His power rested on a street coalition and on the tolerance of the officer corps. That made him fragile, yes, but it also made him unpredictable. If that coalition consolidated, if the Popular Assembly acquired real institutional weight, if the Miners' Federation became a permanent partner in government rather than a pressure group, then Bolivia would not be a Chile. It would be a Cuba, built faster and with far less warning. And then, according to the conspiracy, came the sentence, underlined in the original, or so the story goes, reproduced in a small number of second-hand accounts, and never in a verified document. The Bolivian experiment must not succeed. 7 words, not an order, not a directive, not a finding signed by a president authorizing covert action, which would have created a paper trail and required notification and left fingerprints. Just an assessment, just a description of a desired end state floating in a room full of men who understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it did not require them to say. This is the mechanism the conspiracy is really about, and it is worth pausing on, because it is more unsettling than any cloak and dagger you have ever heard. Consider how a decision gets made in a system built to have no author. A president does not say remove him. A president says, with visible irritation, that he does not want to read another cable about Bolivia. An advisor does not write an order. An advisor writes that the situation requires attention. A station chief does not receive an instruction. A station chief receives a budget line and a shift in reporting priorities, and a promotion for the officer who understands what is wanted. At no point does anyone commit a crime. At no point does anyone lie under oath. And at the end of the chain, a government falls, and every single person involved can say truthfully that they were never told to do it. The conspiracy calls this the directive, not a document, a method, and it gives the operation a name, Station Andean. The name, if it existed, would have been a compartment rather than a station in the conventional sense. Intelligence organizations divide their work into compartments precisely so that no single person can see the whole. You're told what you need to know to do your job. You're not told what the job is for. The conspiracy holds that Station Andean was established in the first quarter of 1971, that it drew personnel from 3 separate directorates, and that its formal charter described it as an information collection effort concerning Soviet and Cuban activity in the Central Andes. That charter would have been technically true, it would also have been almost entirely beside the point, because the actual work, according to the theory, was mapping. Not mapping terrain, mapping people. Who commands the 8th Division? Who does he owe money to? Whose sister did he marry? Which colonels did he graduate with? And which of those does he despise? Who has been passed over for promotion twice? Who has a son studying abroad on a scholarship he cannot actually afford? Who drinks? Who talks when he drinks? Who has a grievance that has been sitting in his chest for 11 years, curdling? This is the unglamorous heart of political intervention, and it has almost nothing to do with the movies. No one gets shot in a stairwell, no one photographs documents with a tiny camera. Men have lunch, men complain about their careers, men discover that someone in the room is a very good listener who agrees with everything they have been thinking for years, and who has, coincidentally, some ideas about how things might be different. The conspiracy claims Station Andean built a file of roughly 240 individuals across the Bolivian military, business community and press. Each entry contained a personal history, a political assessment, a network of relationships, and a single line at the bottom. Disposition. 3 possible values: willing, persuadable, hostile. The number of names in the third category, according to the theory, was far smaller than anyone in Torres's government would have believed. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where a story about history becomes a story about something we cannot verify. The United States did conduct covert operations in Latin America during this period. That is not in dispute. It is a matter of public record, admitted in congressional testimony, documented in declassified files, and in some cases apologised for by later administrations. The Church Committee hearings in the mid-1970s exposed a great deal. The declassification of Chile documents in the late 1990s exposed more. What is disputed is Bolivia specifically. The record there is thinner. Some documents have been released, many have not. Historians who have worked in the archives generally conclude that American officials welcomed the fall of Torres, communicated with figures who opposed him, and provided rapid recognition and assistance to the government that followed. Whether that constitutes participation in a coup, or merely a favourable disposition toward one that was going to happen anyway, is exactly the question that no one has settled. The conspiracy fills that gap with a structure. Whether the structure is a reconstruction or an invention is something you will have to decide for yourself, somewhere in the drifting hours ahead. The money is the part of the story where things become interesting, because money is the one thing that leaves marks even when men do not. The conspiracy claims that funds move through a chain designed to be untraceable, and more importantly to be deniable at every link. It begins with an appropriation that is entirely legitimate: development assistance, agricultural support, educational exchange, public safety programs, money that has been approved by a committee, entered in a ledger, and reported in a public document. That money reaches a foundation. The foundation is real. It has an address, a board, a mission statement about hemispheric cooperation. It funds a scholarship program and a small journal and a series of conferences on economic development. The foundation, in turn, makes grants, some to universities, some to research institutes, some to a Panamanian holding company that describes itself as a consultancy in regional commodity markets. The Panamanian company has one employee and a mailing address in a building on a street in Panama City that housed, at that time, several hundred other companies of similar description. It holds accounts in Switzerland, in a canton whose banking secrecy laws made inquiry effectively impossible. From those accounts, payments go out, to a printing house in La Paz that produces an opposition newspaper, to a trucking association, to a radio station in Santa Cruz, to individuals in cash delivered by hand. At every point in that chain, a person can look at his portion and see nothing wrong. The committee member approved development aid. The foundation officer funded a consultancy. The consultant advised on commodity markets. The printer printed a newspaper. Nobody carried out a conspiracy. Everybody carried out a task. That, according to the theory, is what Station Andean was actually for. Not to conduct an operation. To design a mechanism in which an operation could occur without anyone conducting it. I want to slow down here and talk about how a country actually gets taken, because the movies have ruined our understanding of this, and the reality is much quieter and much more frightening. You do not need an army to overthrow a government. You need about 6 things, and none of them are dramatic. The first is a grievance that already exists. You never manufacture anger. Manufacturing anger is expensive and it never looks real. What you do is find the anger that is already sitting in the country, unattended, and you water it. In Bolivia in 1971 there was an enormous supply. The middle class in La Paz was frightened by the popular assembly. The eastern lowlands resented highland rule. Career officers resented being passed over in favour of politically reliable juniors. Businessmen resented uncertainty. Landowners resented land reform talk. Catholic conservatives resented the atheism of the student left. All of that was there before anyone from outside arrived. It required no invention at all. The second is a story, not propaganda in the crude sense, not leaflets dropped from planes. A story that a person can tell himself in the bathroom mirror that makes what he is about to do feel not merely acceptable but obligatory. In this case, the story was simple and effective and had the advantage of being partially true. The country is sliding toward chaos. The president has lost control. If we do not act, the communists will act first, and then there will be no country left to save. A man who believes that story is not a traitor. He is a patriot with an unpleasant duty. The third is money, and the money is never for weapons. This surprises people. Weapons are the one thing a coup does not need to import because the army already has them. Money goes to the boring things. It goes to a newspaper's newsprint bill. It goes to a radio transmitter's maintenance. It goes to a trucking association so that the trucks can stop moving when it is time for the trucks to stop moving. It goes to a housewives committee organising a march. It goes to a professional association's legal fund. It goes, above all, to time. It buys people the ability to spend 6 months doing politics instead of doing their jobs. The fourth is the network, and the network is built out of ordinary human relationships. There is a documented phenomenon in the history of Latin American militaries, entirely public, entirely acknowledged, of officers who train together in Panama or in the United States forming lifelong professional bonds across national borders. That was the explicit purpose of the programs. It was not sinister on its face. Militaries all over the world do this. But the effect was a continental class of officers who knew each other, trusted each other, spoke a shared professional language, and shared a shared doctrine about what the internal enemy was and what should be done about him. The fifth is a signal, and the signal is the most delicate part. Every potential plotter's first question is not "is this right?" It is "will I be alone?" A coup fails when the units wait to see what other units do, and the units wait because nobody wants to be the only one who moved. So the essential service that an outside party can provide is not money or weapons, it is confidence. It is the quiet transmission, through channels that leave no record, of the message that others are moving, that recognition will be swift, that credit will not be cut off, that the aid will continue, that afterward there will be no consequences. That message is worth more than a division. And the sixth is the absence of an order. Because if there is an order, there is a person who gave it, and a person who gave it can be found, and a person who is found can be made to explain. Whereas if everyone acted on their own understanding, there is nothing to find. There are only men who read the same situation and reach the same conclusion, which is not a crime anywhere on earth. Look at that list again. Look at how little of it is legal. Look at how much of it consists of things that happen in every country and every year for entirely innocent reasons. That is the whole thesis of this episode. Not that a group of men in a room planned a coup, but that a system was constructed in which a coup could occur without any group of men in any room ever having to plan it. Let me tell you about a document that is real, because it is important to know where the line is. In September of 1970, after Salvador Allende won the Chilean election, but before he was confirmed by the Chilean Congress, the Director of Central Intelligence attended a meeting at the White House. Afterward he wrote notes. Those notes were later released, and they are in the public record, and researchers have quoted them extensively. They record instruction to prevent Allende from taking office by any available means, to work through channels that would not implicate the United States, and to apply economic pressure. There is a phrase in them about making the economy scream. There is a note about a 1 in 10 chance of success, but that the effort must go forward. There is an instruction that the American embassy was not to be informed, which tells you something remarkable in itself, that the operation was compartmented against the country's own ambassador. That is not a theory. That is a piece of paper. And the reason it matters to a Bolivia story is that it establishes the mode. It demonstrates that in this exact period, regarding a neighbouring Andean country with a leftist government, there existed at the highest level both the intent and the willingness to act outside official channels, with explicit attention to deniability. Once you know that about Chile, the question about Bolivia stops being whether such a thing is conceivable. It obviously is. The question becomes only whether it happened, and how much, and by whom. And the honest answer is that in Bolivia's case the paper has not surfaced in the same volume. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is also not evidence of presence. It is just absence, and it is a very frustrating place to stand. There is another element to this period that rarely gets discussed, and that deserves a place in any honest account, because it complicates the picture in a way that a simple story cannot accommodate. In 1971, Bolivia became a destination for a particular kind of European. Klaus Barbie had been the head of the Gestapo in Lyon during the German occupation of France. He was responsible for the torture and murder of members of the French resistance, including Jean Moulin, and for the deportation of Jewish children from a home at Lisieux to Auschwitz. He was known as the Butcher of Lyon. After the war, he was employed by American Army counterintelligence, which valued his knowledge of communist networks. This is documented and was later the subject of an official United States government report that included a formal apology to France. When his usefulness ended and French requests for extradition became inconvenient, he was assisted in leaving Europe through a rat line and arrived in South America. He settled in Bolivia. He took the name Klaus Altmann. He became a businessman, and then something more. Under the Banzer government and after, Barbie provided advice to Bolivian security services. He was involved in commercial ventures. He was connected in the accounts of investigators, and later in judicial proceedings, to paramilitary organisation. He lived openly enough that a French Nazi hunter, Peter Klaasfeld, was able to identify and confront him publicly in the early 1970s. He was finally expelled from Bolivia in 1983 after the return of democracy, and tried in France and convicted and died in prison in 1991. I raise this not because Barbie was the architect of anything in 1971. There is no good evidence that he was. I raise it because of what his presence tells you about the environment. This was a place and a period in which a man who had personally tortured people for the Gestapo could live under a slightly altered name, advise a government, run businesses, and be protected by the state for over a decade. That is the ecosystem the conspiracy is describing. Not a secret world, a tolerated one, and it points at something the committee theory is groping toward, however clumsily. The Cold War in Latin America was not neatly divided into American assets and Soviet assets. It was populated by a floating class of people with skills that governments wanted and reputations that governments could not acknowledge. Former fascists, arms dealers, exiled officers, businessmen with unusual connections, men who moved between services and between countries and whose loyalty was to the continuation of their own usefulness. You do not need a committee to explain that class of person. They emerged naturally from the conditions, but if you were going to invent a committee, you would populate it with exactly them. Now we come to the man who would take the palace. Hugo Banzer Suarez was born in 1926 in the lowland province of Santa Cruz, which matters more than it might seem. Bolivia is really two countries wearing one flag. There is the high country, the altiplano, the world of the mines and the indigenous highland communities, and the political culture of La Paz. And there is the east, the lowlands, hot and green and agricultural, oriented toward Brazil and Argentina, culturally distinct, historically resentful of highland dominance. Banzer was of the East. He came up through the military academy, served as a military attaché in Washington, and attended the School of the Americas in the Panama Canal Zone, an institution whose alumni roster reads like a directory of Latin American military governments for the following 20 years. He was, by most accounts, not a brilliant man. He was something more useful. He was patient, organised, personally unremarkable, and capable of sitting in a room full of factions and being the person everyone could tolerate. In January of 1971, he tried to overthrow Juan José Torres. It failed completely. The attempt was poorly coordinated, the units he expected did not move, and within hours it collapsed. Banzer was arrested. And here we arrive at one of the strangest facts in this entire story. A fact that is not conspiracy at all, but plain documented history. Torres let him go. He exiled him to Argentina rather than executing him, imprisoning him, or even stripping him of rank in a way that would have ended his career. Torres, who had come to power with the miners chanting his name, who governed under the constant threat of exactly this kind of attempt, took the man who had just tried to destroy him and put him on a plane. Some historians read this as decency. Torres was, by many accounts, a man genuinely uncomfortable with the machinery of repression. He had seen what the Bolivian state could do to people, and he did not want to be the one operating it. Others read it as fatal naivety. A president who will not eliminate his enemies is a president who is telling his enemies that they may try again. The conspiracy reads it as something else. It suggests that Torres was under pressure not to make a martyr, that intermediaries argued for leniency in the name of national reconciliation, and that some of those intermediaries were precisely the people who most wanted Banzer alive and free and in Argentina. We cannot know, but the fact remains hard and strange. Hugo Banzer walked out of Bolivia in the winter of 1971 because the man he tried to overthrow allowed it. And 7 months later he walked back in and took the country. Buenos Aires in 1971 was a city full of exiles. That is not a metaphor. It was a literal condition of the place. The political convulsions of the era had scattered people across the continent, and Argentina, with its size and its cosmopolitan capital and its own chaotic politics, absorbed a great many of them. Bolivians, Paraguayans, Uruguayans, Chileans, soon enough. Men who had lost, waiting to see if losing was permanent. The exile community had its geography, certain cafes, certain restaurants in the Recoleta district, certain apartment buildings where the doorman knew not to be curious. Banzer moved through this world for 7 months. What he did in that time is partially documented and partially not. He was in contact with the Bolivian Socialist Phalange, a nationalist party with roots going back to the 1930s. He was in contact, more surprisingly, with elements of the nationalist revolutionary movement, the party that had led Bolivia's 1952 revolution and that had once been the great vehicle of Bolivian reform. That party had fractured, and a substantial faction of it had drifted rightward, and its old leader, Victor Paz Estensoro, was himself in exile and interested in a return. This is the alliance that would eventually take power. Not a pure military coup, a coalition of the military, the nationalist right, and a faction of the old. Revolutionary Party united by nothing except a shared conclusion that Torres had to go. Building that coalition took organisation. It took travel, communication, money, and the ability to hold together men who genuinely detested one another. The conspiracy says Banzer did not build it alone. It says the meetings had a facilitator, not a controller, not a handler in the crude sense, but something more like a producer. Someone who arranged the room, who knew who should not be in it at the same time, who carried messages between men who could not be seen speaking, who ensured that funds arrived when they were needed, and that no one had to ask where they came from. The theory calls this figure by a designation rather than a name, the coordinator. According to the story, the coordinator was not American. He held a passport from a neutral European country, spoke 4 languages, and had a business card describing him as a representative of an international trade association. He had been present, allegedly, at similar gatherings elsewhere in the hemisphere. He never gave instructions. He only ever asked questions. What would you need? Who would you require? How long would it take? And then, some weeks later, the thing that was needed would appear, and no one would ever be quite sure who had provided it. Let us talk about the tin. Bolivia's history is, to an extent that is almost tragic, a history of things dug out of the ground and taken away. It begins with Potosi. In the middle of the 16th century, the Spanish found a mountain in what is now southern Bolivia that was made, almost literally, of silver. Cerro Rico, the rich hill. For roughly 200 years it produced a flow of silver so vast that it financed the Spanish Empire, distorted the economy of Europe, and drove inflation across the entire Atlantic world. It was mined by forced indigenous labour under the Meta system. The number of people who died in that mountain over the colonial period is unknown, and estimates vary enormously, but every serious estimate is a number that should stop you cold. There is an old saying that enough silver came out of Potosi to build a bridge to Spain, and enough bones went into it to build the bridge back. When the silver declined, the tin came. Bolivian tin became critical to the industrial world in the 20th century, and control of it concentrated in the hands of three families: the Patiño, Hochschild, and Aramayo interests, the tin barons. Simón Patiño in particular became one of the wealthiest men on earth, and he did it from a country where the men who dug his ore lived in company towns and died of lung disease before 40. The revolution of 1952 nationalised the mines and created Comibol, the state mining corporation. It was one of the great achievements of Bolivian history and one of its great disappointments, because nationalising an industry does not automatically make it profitable, and Comibol spent decades caught between the demands of the workers who had won it and the realities of a commodity market that did not care. By 1970, Bolivia's mineral question had a new dimension: natural gas, and beyond that, the lithium in the vast salt flat of Uyuni, though almost no one was thinking about lithium yet. Torres's economic programme was not, by the standards of the era, radical. He nationalised the Matilda zinc mine. He pursued better terms on gas. He talked about processing more Bolivian ore inside Bolivia, rather than shipping raw material abroad, which is the eternal dream of every resource economy, and the eternal frustration of every company that profits from the current arrangement. The conspiracy argues that this was the real trigger, not the popular assembly, not the socialist rhetoric, the processing. Because a country that only exports raw ore is permanently dependent. It is a supplier. Its position in the world economy is fixed. But a country that begins to smelt, refine and manufacture is a country that has started to climb. And once one country climbs, the argument goes, others begin to wonder why they should not. The theory claims that a memorandum circulated among commodity interests in 1971 warning of precisely this. Not warning of communism, warning of precedent. The phrase attributed to that memorandum has become one of the most quoted lines in this entire body of theory. The danger is not that Bolivia will fail. The danger is that Bolivia will succeed. There is no verified copy of any such memorandum. But the logic in it is not exotic. It is simply the logic of any incumbent facing a change in the terms of trade, and it has been articulated openly, in public, in 100 boardrooms and trade journals across the last century. Every conspiracy needs a witness, someone standing close enough to see the shape of the thing, and far enough down the hierarchy that no one bothers to include her. In this story, that person is Elena Navarro. She should be understood as a composite. Historians of the period have documented several Bolivian journalists who reported on the pre-coup atmosphere, and at least a few who left the country afterward. The figure in this account is drawn from that tradition rather than from a single, verified individual, and I want to say that plainly before we go further, because it would be easy to let a good character carry more weight than the evidence deserves. Navarro, in the telling, was 28 years old in 1971. She worked for a mid-sized La Paz daily, the kind of paper that covered ministry announcements and football and the price of bread. She had studied in Chile and come home with the particular restlessness of someone who has seen another version of her own country and cannot stop comparing. Her assignment was not politics. It was the economy, trade figures, mining output, the dull columns at the back of the paper that no one read, which is exactly why she noticed. It started with newsprint. Newsprint in Bolivia was imported, expensive, and rationed by hard currency availability. Every editor in La Paz knew to the ton how much paper every other editor could afford. It was the kind of thing that came up constantly in the trade. And in the spring of 1971, one paper's consumption changed. An opposition daily, small, poorly written, chronically behind on its bills, suddenly began printing a substantially larger run. Then it improved its paper stock. Then it hired 3 reporters away from better publications by offering salaries that no small opposition daily in a country with Bolivia's foreign exchange problems should have been able to pay. Navarro, who read the trade figures for a living, did the arithmetic. The paper's advertising revenue could not support what the paper was doing. Its circulation could not support it. Its declared ownership had no obvious capacity to subsidize it. Somebody was paying. She started pulling the thread, and the thread went in odd directions. The paper's new printing equipment had been imported through a customs broker in Arica, the Chilean port that handles the bulk of Bolivia's overseas trade. The broker had been paid by a company registered in Panama. The Panamanian company appeared in Bolivian customs records 11 times in 14 months, always as an intermediary, always for shipments whose declared value seemed low relative to their nature. None of this was illegal. Bolivia's import economy ran on exactly this kind of intermediation, and Panamanian shells were as common as dust. But Navarro kept a notebook, and the notebook kept filling. Then she noticed the second pattern, and the second pattern was worse, because it involved men rather than paper. Between March and July of 1971, an unusual number of senior Bolivian officers travelled abroad. Again, individually unremarkable. Officers attend courses. They visit equipment manufacturers. They go to conferences on hemispheric security cooperation, which were a genuine and frequent feature of the period. There is a documented, public, entirely acknowledged system of military exchange and training that operated throughout Latin America, centered on institutions like the School of the Americas. But Navarro built a chart, names down the left side, months across the top, destinations in the boxes, and what the chart showed, in her account, was that the officers travelling were not randomly distributed through the officer corps. They clustered. They were concentrated in specific commands, armoured units around La Paz, the garrison at Santa Cruz, Air Force elements at Cochabamba, communications and logistics. If you were assembling a coup, those are precisely the commands you would need, not the whole army. The army does not need to move, only the units that control the roads, the airfields, the radio and the fuel. She wrote a piece, careful, factual, extensively, hedged, making no allegation and drawing no conclusion, simply presenting the customs figures and the travel pattern side by side and asking whether anyone had noticed. Her editor read it twice and killed it. He was not a coward in her account. He was a man who had worked in Bolivian journalism for 30 years and had watched what happened to people who published certain things. He had a family. He had, more to the point, a very accurate understanding of which way the country was leaning and how briefly the current arrangement was likely to last. The line she attributed to him afterward has become the line most people remember from the whole affair. There are stories that newspapers are not meant to print, not because they are false, because they are early. 6 weeks before the coup, in the account, an envelope was left at the front desk of her building. No return address, no note. 4 pages of photocopy, taken at an angle, the shadow of a hand visible along one edge. It was a diplomatic cable, or a copy of one. The header was partially obscured, the classification line was legible, and the routing indicated a distribution list of exactly 6 recipients. Most of it was administrative, assessments of the Bolivian political situation, notes on labour conditions, personnel matters. But in the 3rd page, in a section on regional coordination, there was a phrase in capital letters that appeared nowhere else in the document and was not defined anywhere in it. Project Lantern. Under that heading were 4 bullet points, each of them so generic that they could have described almost anything, and so specific in combination that they described only one thing: psychological operation support, economic pressure mechanisms, regional coordination, existing channels, contingency planning, Category 2. The 4th page ended mid-sentence. Whatever came next, whatever defined what Category 2 contingency planning meant, was on a page that Navarro never saw and that no researcher has ever produced. She spent the following weeks trying to verify it, and could not. She showed it to a contact at the Foreign Ministry who told her, without appearing to look at it for very long, that it was a forgery and that she should destroy it. She showed a portion of it to an academic in Cochabamba, who said the formatting was consistent with genuine cable traffic, but that formatting could be imitated by anyone with access to a single real example. She hid it. In her account, she sewed it into the lining of a suitcase, which sounds like something from a film, but which is in fact what people actually did, because there was nowhere else to put it. And then it was August. The coup began in Santa Cruz. That detail is important, and it is entirely historical. It did not begin in La Paz, where the palace was. It began 800 kilometres to the east, in the lowland city that was Banzer's home ground, on the 18th of August, 1971. The 8th Division rose. Colonel Andres Selish, a hardline officer with a formidable and unpleasant reputation, took control of the city. Selish, incidentally, was one of the officers present at La Higuera when Che Guevara was killed, which tells you something about how small the world of the Bolivian military actually was. Santa Cruz fell quickly. The garrison was sympathetic. The civilian population of the region had substantial grievances against the Highland government, and the Falange had organised cadres in the city ready to move. Word reached La Paz within hours, and then something happened that the plotters had not fully anticipated, and that would define the character of the next 3 days. The workers armed themselves, not metaphorically. The tin miners of Bolivia had access to dynamite, and they had used it in the streets before, most famously in 1952, when a workers' insurrection had actually defeated the Bolivian army in open combat and made the revolution. That memory was less than 20 years old. The men who had done it were still alive. Some of their sons were in the Popular Assembly. The Labour Confederation called for weapons. University students marched to the barracks demanding rifles. The Popular Assembly, that supposedly powerless debating society, convened in emergency session and voted to defend the government. And Juan José Torres hesitated. This is the moment that everything in the story turns on, and it is a moment about which the historical record is genuinely painfully clear. His own supporters were begging him to distribute arms, and he would not do it. Accounts of why differ. Some say he still believed the loyal units would suppress the rising, and that arming civilians would be unnecessary and destabilising. Some say he had received assurances from senior officers that turned out to be worthless. Some say he could not bring himself to preside over a civil war, in which Bolivians would kill Bolivians in the streets of La Paz on a scale that the 1952 fighting had already demonstrated was possible. And some say, more simply, that he was a general, that 30 years inside an institution had left him unable to make the final psychological break of arming the people against the army, even when the army was coming for him. Whatever the reason, the weapons stayed in the armories for most of a day and a half, and a day and a half was everything. By the 19th of August, the rising had spread. Cochabamba declared for Banzer. then units in Oruro. The Air Force, which had helped bring Torres to power 10 months earlier, split and then went over. Fighting broke out in La Paz itself, around the university and the government buildings and in the working-class districts. The fighting was real. This was not a bloodless palace transfer. Estimates of the dead vary, and the true figure has never been established, but it was in the hundreds, with far more wounded. Students died at the university. Workers died in the streets. Conscript soldiers died because someone told them to advance. Radio stations were the critical objective, as they always are. Whoever controls broadcast controls the story, and in a country where much of the population learned what was happening from a radio in a shop doorway, the story was the battle. Government stations went off the air one by one. Others came on announcing the formation of a new government, calling on citizens to remain calm, describing the fighting as already concluded while it was still going on. By the 21st of August it was over. Juan José Torres took refuge in the Peruvian embassy. Within days he was on a plane. His presidency had lasted 10 months and 11 days. Hugo Banzer entered the Palacio Quemado and began a rule that would last 7 years. What followed is documented and grim. The Banzer government closed the universities, dissolved the Labour Confederation, banned political parties, and conducted a campaign of arrests, exile, and detention. Human rights organisations later documented substantial numbers of deaths and disappearances during the period, along with thousands of arrests and a very large number of people driven into exile. There is a particular episode from 1974 at Talata and Epizana, where the army fired on peasant demonstrators blocking a highway. The death toll has never been definitively established and remains disputed, with figures ranging widely depending on the source. It became known as the Massacre of the Valley. That is the historical record. Now let me tell you what the conspiracy says about the 3 days. It says the coup was too fast. It argues that a genuinely spontaneous military uprising in a country as factional as Bolivia should have produced days or weeks of confused standoff, with garrisons waiting to see which way things fell before committing. That is the normal pattern. Officers are not fools. They wait. Instead, the theory claims, commands went over in a sequence that looks less like contagion and more like a schedule. Santa Cruz, then Cochabamba, then Oruro, then the Air Force. Each one arriving at the moment when it would maximally demoralise the government without ever creating a decisive confrontation. It says the communications failed selectively, that certain loyal units could not reach the palace at key moments, that orders were issued and never received, that a division commander in the Altiplano who intended to move in support of Torres spent critical hours unable to establish contact with anyone and eventually concluded from silence alone that the government had already fallen. Silence, the theory notes, is a weapon. It costs nothing and leaves no evidence, and it is very difficult to prove that a radio was jammed in 1971. And it says something about the embassy. Navarro's account in this telling describes standing on the slope above the city on the night of the 19th and watching a convoy of 3 vehicles enter a foreign embassy compound at an hour when embassies do not receive visitors. Lights off. Gates opened before the lead vehicle arrived, which means someone inside was watching for it. She could not identify the vehicles. She could not see who was in them. She could not say which embassy, in the versions of the story that are most careful, because from that distance in the dark you cannot. But she wrote it down, and the writing down is the whole problem with this kind of evidence, because an entry in a notebook is either the most important document in the case, or a young woman seeing a shape in the dark and giving it a meaning. There is no way to tell the difference. There never is. That is what makes these stories keep their grip on us at 3 a.m. Let me take you underground for a while, because this story has spent a great deal of time in offices, and I do not want you to lose the ground it is standing on. The tin mines of Bolivia sit at altitudes where the air already struggles to sustain a person standing still. Siglo XX, Catavi, Huanuni. Names that mean nothing to most of the world and everything to Bolivian history, A miner entering the shaft descends through a temperature gradient that has no equivalent in most human experience. The surface is freezing. The altiplano at 15,000 feet is cold in a way that gets into the joints. But as you go down, the rock warms, and at depth, the galleries become oppressively hot, humid, and thick with dust. The dust is the killer. Silica dust, fine enough to stay suspended in the air for hours, fine enough to pass every filter the men could afford, fine enough to reach the deepest parts of the lung and lodge there permanently. The body cannot clear it. It responds by building scar tissue around each particle. Over years, the lung slowly turns from an elastic organ into something rigid. Silicosis has no cure. It progresses even after exposure ends. And in the Bolivian mines of that era, where dust suppression was minimal and equipment was old and men worked long shifts because they were paid by production, it arrived early and it arrived reliably. Men entered those mines as teenagers. A great many did not see 50. There is a figure in Bolivian mining culture called the Tío, the uncle. In the tunnels, the miners build statues of him, seated figures made of clay and ore, with horns and staring eyes, often with an erect phallus, always with a cigarette placed in the mouth. They bring him offerings, coca leaves, alcohol, cigarettes. The Tío is the owner of the underground. Above ground, the miners are Catholic and go to Mass and observe the saints. Below ground, that authority ends. The mountain belongs to someone else, and if you want the mountain to let you take its ore and let you leave again with your life, you must acknowledge him. The anthropology of this is fascinating and the psychology is unbearable, because what it really encodes is an accurate perception. The men understood perfectly that they were engaged in a transaction with a force that did not care about them and would eventually take what it was owed. They were not being superstitious, they were being precise. Now understand what it meant that these men had dynamite. Mining requires explosives, and the miners handled them daily, and they knew exactly what a stick of dynamite does in a confined space. In 1952, when the revolution came, armed miners descending on La Paz were a decisive military factor. They defeated regular army units. That was not a legend. It was recent, verifiable history, and every officer in the Bolivian army knew it the way a person knows about a fire in their own house. This is why the Miners' Federation mattered. This is why the Popular Assembly frightened people so profoundly. Not because of its debates, because behind its delegates stood tens of thousands of men who had already, once, within living memory, taken the country by force. And this is why the moment when Juan José Torres refused to distribute weapons in August of 1971 is the single heaviest moment in this entire story. The miners came for rifles. The men who had made 1952, or their sons, came to the government they had put in power and asked to be allowed to defend it. And a general said no. There is a particular kind of tragedy in that, and it is not the tragedy of betrayal. Torres did not betray them. He was, by nearly every account including hostile ones, personally honest and personally decent. He did not want a bloodbath in the streets of La Paz. He did not want to be the president who armed civilians against the army. He believed, or made himself believe, that the loyal units would hold. He was wrong, and being wrong cost hundreds of lives anyway, and then cost the country 7 years of dictatorship, and then cost him his own life in a field outside Buenos Aires 5 years later. The conspiracy has a reading of this moment, and it is one of its more sophisticated arguments. It says that the refusal was anticipated, that the men mapping the Bolivian political landscape had assessed Torres personally, and concluded that he was a general first and a revolutionary second, and that at the decisive moment his institutional loyalty would paralyse him. It says, in other words, that the operation did not need to defeat Torres. It only needed to be shaped around the specific way that Torres would fail. That is a chilling proposition, but it is not a wild one. Character assessment is a real and central function of intelligence work. Knowing what a man will do under pressure is more valuable than knowing what he thinks, because what he thinks changes, and what he does under pressure almost never does. And if you had built a file on Juan José Torres, If you had 200 pages on his career and his relationships and his psychology, you would have known one thing above all. He let Hugo Banzer live. In January of 1971, a man tried to take his country from him by force, and Torres put him on a plane. Everything the operation needed to know about how Torres would behave in a crisis was contained in that single decision, 7 months in advance, in plain view. The miners paid for it. They kept paying for it. Under the Banzer government, the mining communities were occupied, union leaders were arrested and exiled, and the radio stations the miners had built and operated themselves were shut down. Those radio stations deserve their own mention, because they are one of the most remarkable things Bolivia produced in the 20th century. Starting in the 1950s, the miners' unions built and funded their own radio network, paid for by voluntary deductions from wages. Small stations in mining camps, broadcasting in Spanish and Quechua and Aymara. They carried news, union announcements, music, and personal messages between families in a country where telephones barely existed outside the cities. During coups, they were the resistance. When the army moved, the mining radios reported it. When the government stations were seized, the mining stations kept broadcasting, and soldiers had to physically capture each transmitter to silence it. There are accounts of announcers staying on the air, describing the troops approaching the building, until the broadcast cut off. Think about that as you lie there in the dark. A voice in a wooden hut at 13,000 feet, describing the men coming up the road, so that other people, far away, would know. That is what was silenced in August of 1971. Not just a government. A whole apparatus by which a group of people who had been at the very bottom of a very steep society had built themselves a way to speak. Whatever else you conclude about who did what and why, that part is not in dispute, and I think it is the part worth carrying with you. Now the story leaves 1971, and the tone changes, because what happens next is not a thriller. It is the slow, dusty, unglamorous work of the archive, which is where nearly all real conspiracy investigation actually lives, and where nearly all of it goes to die. Navarro left Bolivia in 1972. She went to Mexico, which took in an enormous number of Latin American exiles during those decades and which deserves more credit for it than it usually gets. She worked for a wire service, she married. She stopped writing about Bolivia for a long time, in the way that people stop touching a thing that hurts. She came back to it in the 1990s. The reason was declassification. In the middle of that decade, following a change of government in Chile and sustained pressure from human rights organizations and from families of the disappeared, the United States began releasing large volumes of documents relating to its Cold War activity in South America. The Chile Declassification Project alone eventually released tens of thousands of records. Similar, smaller releases followed for other countries. Archives in Paraguay had already produced the extraordinary find known as the Archives of Terror, discovered in a police station in 1992, containing detailed records of transnational repression. For anyone who had spent 20 years being told they were imagining things, this period was a vindication and a devastation at the same time. Because what the documents showed, in the aggregate, was that a great deal of what had been dismissed as paranoid fantasy was simply true. Not all of it. That matters. Many specific allegations turned out to be false, exaggerated, or attributed to the wrong parties, but the general shape, the existence of covert programs, the funding of opposition media, the cultivation of military contacts, the coordination between security services across borders, the knowledge and tolerance of what those services did to people, all of that had documentary support. And at the centre of it was Operation Condor. Condor was real. This is not conspiracy theory. It is established history with a substantial documentary record and multiple criminal convictions in courts across several countries. It was a coordinated program among the security services of the Southern Cone dictatorships, formalised at a meeting in Santiago in November of 1975, though cooperation had begun informally earlier. Its founding members were Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil and Bolivia. Ecuador and Peru later had associated roles. Its purpose was the pursuit of political opponents across national borders. A person who fled Uruguay for Argentina or Chile for Bolivia was not safe. The services shared intelligence, coordinated surveillance, and in a significant number of documented cases conducted joint operations to detain, transfer and kill exiles. The number of victims is disputed and probably unknowable in full, but tribunals and researchers have documented many hundreds of cases directly attributable to Condor, within a much larger toll from the dictatorships individually. American knowledge of Condor is documented. Declassified records show that officials were aware of the coordination and of its purposes. The extent of active support versus passive awareness remains genuinely contested among historians, and I'm not going to pretend it is settled, because it is not. Now, here is the observation that generates the conspiracy. Bolivia's coup happened in August 1971. Chile's happened in September 1973. Uruguay's formal military takeover was in June 1973. Argentina's was in March 1976. Condor was formalised in November 1975. Bolivia was first. And the conspiracy asks a question that is, I have to admit, not an unreasonable question to ask. Was it a beginning, or was it a prototype? The theory holds that Bolivia in 1971 was where the method was assembled and tested. Not the violence, which was old. The architecture. Media influence through untraceable funding. Economic pressure applied through commodity markets and credit rather than sanctions. Cultivation of military networks through exchange programs and personal relationship. Coordination across borders through existing security channels. Operational compartmentalization such that no participant could describe the whole, and above all the absence of any authorizing document, so that afterward, when the investigations came, there would be nothing to find because there had never been anything to write down. Every one of those elements appears in more developed form in the documented history of Condor. The conspiracy says that is not evolution. It says it is deployment. And then, in the version of this story that keeps people awake, there is the ledger. The account holds that in the late 1990s, a retired intelligence officer contacted Navarro. He was dying. He had emphysema and perhaps 8 months. He had spent his career in a service that the theory does not name, and he wanted, in the ancient tradition of dying men, to put something down before he could not. He had a ledger. It was not a document of any government. It was a private record kept in a small ruled notebook covering the period from January 1971 to February 1972. He had kept it, he said, because in his line of work a man who cannot prove what he did is a man who can be made to have done anything. The entries were sparse, a date, a location code, a figure in United States dollars, an initial or a 2-letter designation, and at the top of certain pages, a mark. Not a word, a small symbol, drawn in the same hand, appearing beside roughly a third of the entries. When Navarro asked what it meant, the officer told her it indicated which authority the disbursement had been made on behalf of. She asked which authority, and he said the thing that turns this from a story about a coup into a story about something else. He said, not mine. He said the money on those pages did not come from his service. It did not come from any national service. It came from a body that had no letterhead and no address and no name that anyone used out loud, and that the people who worked with it referred to, when they had to refer to it at all, simply as the committee. Its members, according to him, were not exclusively American. They included Europeans. They included at least 2 men from South American countries. They included people from banking, from commodity trading, from the insurance business, and from intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic. They did not meet in any capital. They met at conferences that existed for other reasons, in the margins of them, in the hours between panels, and their organising principle was not ideology, it was stability. This is the part of the theory that I find, whatever else you make of it, genuinely interesting as an idea. because it inverts the entire framework of the Cold War. The conventional story of the 20th century is a story of belief, capitalism against communism, two competing visions of how human beings should organise themselves, fighting for the world. The committee in this telling did not care about that fight, it cared about volatility. Revolutions are expensive, nationalisations disrupt supply, currency collapse destroys contracts, political uncertainty raises the cost of capital across an entire region. Insurers cannot price risk in a country that might have 3 governments in a year. From that view, a socialist government that pays its debts and honours its contracts is fine, and a right-wing government that seizes assets and defaults is a catastrophe. Ideology is noise, the signal is predictability. Torres was not, in this analysis, a problem because he was left-wing. He was a problem because he was unpredictable, because his coalition was unstable, because his economic program threatened to change the terms of resource extraction in a way that other countries might copy, and because he sat at the geographic centre of a continent where 3 governments had already begun moving in the same direction. Bolivia was not a domino. It was a hinge. And so, the theory says, an intervention occurred that was not really American, though Americans participated. Not really Bolivian, though Bolivians executed it. Not really about communism at all. It was maintenance. Juan José Torres spent his exile in Chile first, which was a reasonable choice in 1971 and a disastrous one by September of 1973. When Salvador Allende's government fell and the Chilean military took power, Bolivian exiles in Santiago found themselves in a country that had become, overnight, a partner of the government that had driven them out. Many were detained in the National Stadium, some were handed back across borders. Torres got out. He went to Argentina. Argentina in the mid-1970s was descending into its own catastrophe. The Peronist restoration had collapsed into factional violence. Right-wing death squads operated with state tolerance, and in March of 1976 the military seized power and began the period that Argentines call the process, in which tens of thousands of people were disappeared. Torres lived quietly in Buenos Aires. He wrote, he kept in touch with other exiles. He was, by all accounts, not conspiring against anyone. He was a man in his mid-50s who had been president of a country for 10 months and was now living in a rented apartment in a foreign city. On the 1st of June, 1976, he was taken from the street. His body was found on the 2nd of June in a rural area of Buenos Aires province near the town of Chacabuco. He had been shot several times in the head. His hands were bound. The killing was, by broad scholarly and judicial consensus, carried out within the framework of Operation Condor. Bolivian and Argentine security services are understood to have coordinated. Later legal proceedings in Argentina addressed the case as part of the wider prosecution of Condor crimes. His body was returned to Bolivia, and then, in a final indignity, the Banzer government did not permit a public funeral. He was buried without ceremony. It was not until 1983, after democracy returned, that he received a state funeral. Enormous crowds attended. For the conspiracy, the murder of Juan José Torres is the proof that closes the loop. A man is removed from power in 1971 by a system that does not yet formally exist, and 5 years later, the same system, now formalised and named, reaches across a border to kill him. The mechanism that took his government also took his life. It simply had a filing designation by then. There is a coda to this story that is usually told last, and I want to tell it, but I want to tell it honestly, because I do not know whether it is true. The version says that decades later, an archivist in Washington was clearing a storage area during a facility consolidation. Ordinary work, boxes, shelving, the residue of an institution that had accumulated paper for 50 years. In the back was a filing cabinet, 4 drawers, government issue, with a label on the side that had been typed and then partially covered by a newer adhesive strip. The label read, Bolivia, 1970 to 1971. 3 drawers were empty. The fourth contained a single folder, not empty, sealed, with a strip of tape that had yellowed and gone brittle at the edges, and on the cover, written by hand in pencil, was a sentence with no signature and no date. Successful implementation requires that participants never understand the entire plan. That is the story as it is told. I have never found a source for it that goes back further than the story itself, which is the fate of most beautiful details in this business. It has the shape of a thing invented to end a story, because it ends the story perfectly. But I will say this, as a description of how these operations actually work, that sentence is entirely accurate. Whether anyone wrote it on a folder or not, someone at some point had to understand it, or none of this would have functioned at all. So let me be a fair guide through the last part of the night and give you the case against everything I have just told you. The Bolivian coup of 1971 has an entirely sufficient domestic explanation, and most serious historians of the country favour it. Torres governed with a coalition that could not hold. He alienated the officer corps by opening the government to the left, and he alienated the left by refusing to go far enough. The Popular Assembly frightened the middle class and the business community without giving the workers real power. The economy was under strain. The regional grievances of Santa Cruz were genuine and long-standing, and had nothing to do with Washington. And Bolivia had, in the century and a half before 1971, experienced an extraordinary number of changes of government by force. A coup in Bolivia in 1971 required no external explanation whatsoever. Coups in Bolivia were the weather. The Condor connection, likewise, has a simpler reading. Condor was formalised in 1975. Bolivia joined as one of 6 member states. The reason a Bolivian coup in 1971 shares features with Condor is not that it was a prototype. It is that the same regional security establishment, the same training pipelines, the same doctrine of internal enemy, and in many cases literally the same officers, were involved in both. Common cause, common method, no hidden hand required. The committee is where the theory goes furthest beyond evidence, and I think it is worth being blunt about it. A transnational body of financiers and intelligence officials coordinating interventions across continents is a claim of enormous magnitude supported, in every version I have found, by an unverified account of an unnamed man's private notebook that no one has seen. That is not evidence, that is a shape that fits a hole. And there is a deeper problem, which is that this kind of theory can be a way of not looking at what is documented. The real history is bad enough. Coups happened, interventions happened, Condor happened, and people were tortured and thrown from aircraft and buried without names, and that is established fact with convictions attached. When we reach past that toward a shadowy committee, we risk making the real crimes seem less real, because we have wrapped them in something that sounds invented. The most honest thing I can tell you is this: there was a directive in Bolivia, almost certainly, not a document, not a signature, a shared understanding among people with power that a particular outcome was desired, and that anyone who produced it would be treated well, and anyone who obstructed it would not. That is how most of it actually works. Not a room where the plan is written, a climate in which the plan does not need to be, and that, in the end, may be the most disturbing version of the story, because a conspiracy can be exposed, a file can be found, a witness can talk, but you cannot declassify a climate, you cannot subpoena an atmosphere, you cannot find the folder, because the folder was never filled, because nobody ever had to write anything down. Somewhere in the Andes tonight the air is thin and the sky is that deep purple blue, and a mountain in Potosi that has been mined for 480 years is still standing, hollowed out, sinking slowly into itself. Beneath the salt flat at Uyuni lies what may be the largest lithium deposit on Earth. The batteries of the next century may come from that ground, and already there are negotiations and consortiums and men in good suits arriving on flights from places that are not Bolivia, and terms being discussed about who processes what and where and for whose benefit. The same question, the same country, a different mineral. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this content, please hit that hype points button. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a huge difference in getting these stories out to more people. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. No pressure. Alright, let's get into it. October 28th, 1955, Norfolk, Virginia. The morning shift at Betty's diner started like any other. Coffee brewing in the big steel percolator. The smell sharp and bitter and perfect. Bacon sizzling on the griddle. Grease popping in a rhythm Betty Kowalski had known for 8 years. The familiar symphony of a working-class breakfast joint coming to life. Truck drivers at the counter nursing their first cups. Factory workers on break before the shift change. The regulars, all of them, faces Betty knew better than her own family sometimes. She knew what Tommy wanted before he sat down. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, rye toast. She knew that Margaret would order oatmeal but only eat half. She knew that the construction crew from the shipyard site would pile into the corner booth and split 3 breakfast platters between 5 men because money was tight and pride was tighter. But the man who stumbled through her door at 7:43 that Tuesday morning was not a regular. Betty noticed him immediately, the way you notice something wrong in a familiar pattern, the way a discordant note stands out in a song you've heard 1,000 times. He wore a navy pea coat, not the modern kind, not the surplus store vintage that sailors sometimes wore. This was genuinely old. The wool was thick and heavy, the kind they stopped making after the war because it cost too much and weighed too much, and modern sailors didn't need that kind of protection anymore. The buttons were tarnished brass, not the polished kind. The collar was worn smooth from years of use, decades maybe. It looked like it belonged in a museum, carefully preserved behind glass with a placard explaining what sailors wore during World War II. But this coat wasn't preserved. It was worn. Recently worn. There was lint on the shoulders, a fresh coffee stain on the cuff. It smelled like mothballs and salt air, and something else Betty couldn't quite place. Something like ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. The man's face was pale, not the healthy pale of someone who worked indoors, but the waxy pale of someone who'd been sick for a long time, or scared for a long time. His eyes were the worst part. They darted around the diner like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in details with desperate intensity. The chrome napkin dispensers, the red vinyl booth seats, the clock on the wall shaped like a coffee cup. He stared at the clock for a full 10 seconds, mouth slightly open, like he couldn't believe what it was telling him. Betty grabbed a menu and a coffee pot, put on her professional smile, the one that said she'd seen everything, and nothing surprised her anymore. She approached his booth. "Morning, hun. Coffee to start?" The man didn't answer, didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at his hands now, turning them over slowly like he was checking to make sure they were still attached. His fingers were trembling. "Sir, you okay?" Betty set the coffee pot down, genuine concern replacing the professional smile. Something was very wrong here. The man finally looked at her, his eyes focused with visible effort. "What year is it?" Betty felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the diner. 1955, she said carefully. October. The man's face did something strange. Relief and horror fighting for dominance. He laughed, but it came out wrong, like a sob disguised as laughter. 12 years, he whispered. "It's been 12 years. Before Betty could ask what he meant, the man reached into his coat with trembling hands. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated, like he was relearning how to use his arms. He pulled out a manila envelope and Betty noticed his fingernails were wrong. Too long, ragged, like he'd been scratching at something for a very long time. The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges, the kind of paper they'd used during the war when everything was rationed and nothing was wasted. "I need you to keep this," he said. His voice was hoarse, scratched raw. "They're coming. They always come. But maybe this time someone will listen. Maybe this time someone will tell the truth." Betty took the envelope because she didn't know what else to do. The paper felt strange under her fingers, too dry, too fragile. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" The man gripped her wrist suddenly with surprising strength. His skin was cold. "I was on the Eldridge, the visibility test, October 43, Philadelphia. We were there when they turned on the field. We were there when everything went wrong." The diner had gone quiet. Betty hadn't noticed when the conversation stopped, but they had. Everyone was watching now. Tommy at the counter, coffee forgotten. The construction crew, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. Margaret with her hand frozen on her water glass. All of them sensing that something was happening, something they'd tell their families about later, something that would become a story they'd repeat for years. That's when the two men in dark suits walked through the door. They didn't storm in, didn't announce themselves. They simply appeared, and the quality of the air in the diner changed. Betty would think about it later, try to explain it to the police and to herself, and eventually to the journalist who'd come asking questions. The best she could describe it was that the temperature dropped. Not, dramatically, not enough to see your breath. Just a sudden coolness, like someone had opened a freezer door somewhere nearby. The suits were unremarkable. Dark grey, well-tailored but not expensive. The kind of suits that middle management wore, the kind designed to be forgotten 5 minutes after you stopped looking at them. The men themselves were the same. Average height, average build, average faces. Betty couldn't have described them if someone put a gun to her head. Not their hair colour, not their eye colour, not a single distinguishing feature. But the sailor knew them. His entire body went rigid when he saw them. The colour drained from his already pale face. His hand released Betty's wrist and started trembling so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "They found me," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, thick with resignation and fear. "They always find us. Doesn't matter where we go. Doesn't matter how long we run. They always find us." He looked at Betty one more time and she saw tears in his eyes. "Don't let them take it. Please, don't let them bury this again. We deserve to be remembered. We deserve to be real." The men in suits moved with practiced efficiency. No badges shown, no explanations given, no acknowledgement of the other customers watching. They simply took the sailor by the arms, one on each side, and guided him toward the door. He didn't resist, didn't fight. His body went limp between them, like a puppet with cut strings. But at the door he stopped, used what must have been his last reserve of strength to turn his head, to look back at Betty one final time. "We were buried in the field," he said. His voice was clear now, carrying across the silent diner. Every person there heard it. Every person there would remember. Tell them we were buried in the field. Tell them we were real. Tell them we existed. Then he was gone. The suits, the sailor, all of it disappeared through the door. Betty rushed to the window in time to see a black sedan pull away from the curb. She looked for the license plate, some detail to report, to hold on to prove this had actually happened. There was no plate, just smooth metal where the plate should have been. The diner stayed quiet for a long moment. Then everyone started talking at once. What was that? Who were those men? Should someone call the police? Did you see his face? Did you hear what he said? The questions overlapped, voices rising, everyone trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Betty stood there with the envelope in her hands, feeling its impossible lightness, its terrible weight. She looked down at it. The handwriting on the front was shaky, written by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. "To whoever finds this, we were there. We were buried in the field." Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were 3 items, each one a small piece of impossible truth. First, a photograph. Black and white, the edges worn soft from handling. A naval destroyer photographed from the dock, the morning sun catching the grey paint of her hull. The image was slightly out of focus, taken quickly, without time for proper framing, but the hull number was clear. DE-173. Betty didn't know ships, didn't know naval designations, but she knew numbers, and these numbers were stamped clearly on the bow, the USS Eldridge, Second, a slip of paper with coordinates written in the same trembling hand. Numbers and letters that meant nothing to Betty, but would later be identified by people who understood such things as coordinates, marking waters off the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Third, a date. Just a date. Written larger than the coordinates, underlined 3 times like the writer had wanted to make absolutely sure it couldn't be missed or misunderstood. October the 28th, 1943. Betty looked at the calendar behind her counter. October the 28th, 1955. Exactly 12 years to the day. The sailor's words echoed in her mind. It's been 12 years. She didn't know about the Philadelphia experiment, didn't know the legends, the stories, the whispered rumours that had circulated among certain circles for years. She was a diner owner in Norfolk, Virginia, not a conspiracy theorist, not someone who paid attention to fringe theories about government experiments and wartime secrets. But she knew someone who did pay attention to those things. There was a journalist who'd been coming to the diner for the past few months. Always ordered the same thing, coffee and pie, whatever pie was fresh that day. Always sat in the corner booth with a notebook and a pile of government documents. Always asked questions. Careful questions, polite questions. Questions designed not to spook people but to extract information. He'd been asking about the war, about experiments, about naval facilities and classified programs and sailors who came back different, changed, wrong somehow. Betty had paid attention because that's what diner owners do. They listen. They remember. They connect dots that other people miss. His name was Henry Lockwood, and this envelope would consume the next decade of his life. Act 1. The real history. Henry Lockwood had always been drawn to the stories that lived in the margins, not the headline news, not the official narratives that appeared in polished columns under bylines that people recognised. He chased the stories that made editors uncomfortable, that required more verification than seemed worthwhile, that opened doors to rooms most people preferred to keep locked. He'd started his career covering local corruption in Philadelphia, the kind of grinding investigative work that involved months in dusty archives and interviews with people who spoke in whispers and looked over their shoulders. Then came the war, and Henry had tried to enlist. Flat feet and asthma kept him stateside, kept him watching from a distance as other men his. Age shipped out to Europe and the Pacific, so he'd found another way to serve, covered the home front, the factories, the shipyards, the training facilities, started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Workers at the Philadelphia Naval Yard who wouldn't talk about certain projects, scientists who appeared on personnel lists but whose work was never described, budget allocations that went to programs with no official names. After the war, he'd pivoted to covering what came next, Operation Paperclip, the government's recruitment of Nazi scientists. He'd broken a story about a rocket engineer who'd used slave labour and was now living comfortably in Huntsville, Alabama, building missiles for the army. The story had gotten him death threats and a Peabody nomination in the same week. By the time Betty Kowalski called him about the envelope, Henry Lockwood was exactly the kind of journalist that government agencies watched carefully and ordinary sources trusted implicitly. He'd earned a reputation for protecting his sources, for getting details right, for not publishing until he was absolutely certain. He drove to Norfolk the same day Betty called, listened to her story, took notes in his precise shorthand, asked clarifying questions that revealed he was taking this seriously. He examined the envelope, the photograph, the coordinates, the date. Didn't dismiss it, didn't jump to conclusions, just absorbed the information with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the truth usually hid in details other people overlooked. "Tell me about the sailor," Henry said, pen poised over his notebook. "Physical description, anything distinctive you remember." Betty described the peacoat, the pale face, the wrong fingernails, the way he'd asked what year it was, the terror when he saw the men in suits. "And the suits," Henry pressed. "Can you describe them?" "That's the thing," Betty said. "I can't. I saw them. We all saw them. But I couldn't tell you what they looked like. Average everything. Forgettable on purpose." Henry wrote that down, underlined it twice. Forgettable on purpose. That was interesting. That suggested training, methodology, purpose. The Philadelphia experiment was not new to Henry. He'd encountered references to it over the years, whispers in the same circles that talked about UFOs and mind control, and other fringe topics that serious journalists learned to avoid. The story went that in October 1943, the Navy had conducted an experiment in invisibility, trying to make the USS Eldridge disappear from enemy radar. Depending on who told the story, the ship had either vanished completely, teleported to Norfolk, or opened a portal to another dimension. It was the kind of story that sounded like science fiction, the kind that legitimate sources denied and conspiracy theorists embraced. Henry had always filed it in the same mental category as alien autopsies and faked moon landings. Interesting, maybe based, on a kernel of truth somewhere, but ultimately unprovable and not worth his limited time. But this envelope changed things. Not because it proved the experiment happened, but because someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to deliver this information. Someone had been scared enough, desperate enough to walk into a random diner and hand classified material to a stranger, and someone else had cared enough to send suits to retrieve that person within minutes. That suggested the story wasn't just fringe theory. It suggested there was something real underneath the legend, something worth protecting, something worth covering up. Henry started with the basics. The photograph showed the USS Eldridge. That much was verifiable. He travelled to Washington, to the Naval History and Heritage Command, the repository of Navy records and documentation, filed the proper requests, showed the proper credentials, and gained access to the official record of the USS Eldridge. The ship was real. Cannon-class destroyer escort, hull number DE-173, commissioned on August 27, 1943 at the Newark shipyard of the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. Standard armament for the class, designed for anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort duty. Crew complement of approximately 215 officers and men. The official record showed routine service, shakedown crews, equipment trials, convoy duty in the Atlantic, Mediterranean operations in 44 and 45, survival of the war, transfer to Greece in 51 as part of the military assistance program, renamed Leon, continued service in the Hellenic Navy until decommissioning in the early 70s. Nothing unusual, nothing classified, just another warship with an unremarkable history written in bureaucratic precision. But Henry had learned to read between the lines of official records. He'd learned that what wasn't said was often more important than what was. And the deck logs for October 1943 had some very interesting omissions. Every naval vessel kept detailed daily logs, position reports, weather observations, activities, drills, personnel changes, equipment maintenance. The logs were supposed to be comprehensive, a minute-by-minute record of shipboard life that would allow historians to reconstruct exactly what happened on any given day. Henry had read hundreds of deck logs in his career. He knew the rhythm of them, the standardized language, the level of detail that was considered normal. The Eldridge's logs for September and November 1943 matched that standard. Position fixes given to the minute, activities described in detail, weather recorded multiple times per day. But October was different. The entries were sparse, vague in a way that felt deliberately vague. Position reports gave general areas instead of specific coordinates. East Coast operations instead of exact latitude and longitude. Activities were summarized instead of detailed. Equipment trials and maintenance, instead of descriptions of what equipment was being tested or what maintenance was being performed. And for October 28th, the date on the envelope, the date the sailor had mentioned, the entire entry read, routine maintenance and equipment testing, Brooklyn Navy Yard, no incidents to report. Henry stared at that entry for a long time. No incidents to report was an interesting phrase. It wasn't standard log language. Usually, if nothing notable happened, you simply didn't mention it. You listed the routine activities and moved on. But no incidents to report suggested that someone had anticipated there might be incidents, had specifically wanted to make clear for the record that there had not been incidents. had used language that almost invited speculation about what those incidents might have been. It was the kind of phrase that appeared after investigations, after questions from higher up the chain of command, after someone had demanded clarification about something that may or may not have happened. Henry photographed the logs, requested copies through official channels, and started digging into what the Navy had actually been working on in October 1943. World War II had accelerated technological development in ways that were hard to overstate. Radar, sonar, proximity fuses, jet engines, atomic weapons. The line between science fiction and science fact had blurred almost completely. If you'd told someone in 1935 that in 10 years there would be flying bombs, self-guided torpedoes, and weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion, they would have laughed at you. By 1943, the impossible had become routine. Scientists and engineers were pushing boundaries that had seemed inviolable just years earlier. And the Navy, facing submarine warfare that was bleeding the Atlantic supply lines, was willing to try almost anything that might give them an edge. Degaussing was real. Henry found extensive documentation about it. The technique involved wrapping ships in electromagnetic coils that would neutralize the vessel's magnetic signature, protecting against magnetic mines and making submarine detection more difficult. It was standard technology by mid-war, installed on hundreds of ships, completely unclassified. Radar countermeasures were real. Early attempts to reduce radar cross-section, experimental coatings and hull modifications, anything that might make a ship harder to detect on enemy screens. Some of it worked, some of it didn't, but the research was extensive and mostly documented. But then Henry found something that made him pause. Buried in a filing cabinet in the Office of Naval Research Archives, yellowed and forgotten, was a memo dated April 1957, 14 years after the alleged experiment. The subject line read, "Response to inquiry regarding alleged teleportation. Experiment, USS Eldridge, October 1943. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the document. The memo was brief, written in the clipped bureaucratic language that characterized official denials. It acknowledged that rumors had been circulating about an invisibility or teleportation experiment. It stated clearly and unequivocally that no such experiment had occurred, that the technology required for such an experiment did not exist in 1943 and still did not exist in 1957. But then came the final paragraph, the one that Henry read 3 times to make sure he was understanding it correctly. However, it should be noted that electromagnetic field research was conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the relevant time period. Said research was classified under Project Rainbow and related to degaussing and countermeasure development. While no experiments involving teleportation or invisibility occurred, the presence of this research and the associated equipment installations may have contributed to misunderstandings among personnel not briefed on the program's actual purpose. All records related to Project Rainbow remain classified and are not available for public review. Project Rainbow. Henry felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't a complete denial. This was an acknowledgement disguised as a denial. The Navy was admitting that classified electromagnetic research had been conducted at Philadelphia in October 43. They were admitting the research was significant enough to still be classified 14 years later. They were even admitting that the research might have been mysterious enough to confuse people who saw it. What they weren't doing was explaining what Project Rainbow actually was. Henry spent the next month searching for anything related to Project Rainbow. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewed retired naval officers, traced budget allocations through congressional records. Most of what he found was redacted or missing, pages removed from files with notes saying classified material removed or transferred to secure storage. But he did find one interesting connection. Rainbow was indeed a real naval code name, used not just for one project but as an umbrella designation for multiple countermeasure research programs. Radar jamming, magnetic camouflage, acoustic deception, anything designed to make enemy detection more difficult or confused, which raised an obvious question. If Rainbow was just a code name for conventional countermeasure research, why was it still classified in 1957? Degaussing was public knowledge. Radar jamming was public knowledge. What exactly had the Rainbow program been working on that still couldn't be revealed more than a decade after the war ended? Henry's next lead came from the Philadelphia experiment's most famous witness, a man named Carl Meredith Allen. Sometimes he went by Carlos Allende, sometimes just Carlos Allen. He'd sent letters to the Office of Naval Research in the 1950s claiming to have witnessed the experiment firsthand. Henry had read copies of those letters years ago, when he first encountered the Philadelphia experiment story. They were strange documents, rambling and marginalia filled, written in a distinctive style that mixed technical language with mystical speculation. Allen claimed he'd been serving on a merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, and had watched the Eldridge disappear from Philadelphia and reappear in Norfolk. The Navy had dismissed the letters as crackpot nonsense. Henry had initially agreed. But after finding the Project Rainbow memo, he decided to track down Allen's surviving family and see if there was anything more to the story. Allen had died in 1994, but his sister still lived outside Philadelphia. Henry called her, explained he was researching wartime naval operations, mentioned her brother's name carefully, watching for her reaction. There was a long silence on the phone. Then, "You're the first person to ask about Carl in years. Most people think he was crazy." "Was he?" Henry asked gently. Another pause. "I don't know. He saw something. Something that scared him for the rest of his life. Whether it was what he claimed it was, I can't say. But he wasn't lying. He believed every word he wrote." Henry drove to Pennsylvania the next day. Allen's sister Margaret met him at a coffee shop. She was in her 70s, cautious, protective of her brother's memory, but also tired of carrying the burden of his obsession alone. He started talking about it in the late 40s, Margaret explained. Would wake up from nightmares, describing this green light, this horrible humming sound. He'd draw diagrams of ships surrounded by coils, said the Navy was experimenting with things they didn't understand, that they'd opened something they couldn't close. Did he keep any records, notes, journals, anything? Margaret hesitated. He kept a diary, made me promise not to let anyone see it while he was alive. Said it was too dangerous, but he's been gone for years now, and I'm old. I'd rather someone knew the truth, whatever the truth is, than let it die with me. She went to her car, returned with a leather-bound journal. The cover was water-stained, the pages yellowed. The title on the first page, written in careful script, Project Rainbow Observations. Henry's pulse quickened. Carl Allen, the supposed crackpot, had used the exact code name that appeared in classified Navy documents. A code name that wasn't public knowledge in the 1950s. A code name he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd actually encountered it somewhere. Somehow. "May I make copies?" Henry asked. Margaret nodded. "That's why I brought it. I want someone to know. I want someone to care." Henry spent 3 days going through the diary, photographing every page, taking notes, cross-referencing details with what he'd already learned. The journal was exactly as strange as Allen's letters had been. Parts of it were lucid, detailed observations of ships and dates and locations. Other parts devolved into paranoid speculation about government surveillance and parallel dimensions. But scattered throughout were specific technical details that felt authentic. References to electromagnetic coils and vacuum tubes, descriptions of equipment being transferred from Philadelphia to Brooklyn in late October 1943, mentions of scientists and mathematicians working on classified Navy projects, and one entry, dated November 1943, that made Henry stop breathing for a moment. "Met a sailor today outside a bar in Philadelphia. He approached me when he saw my merchant marine jacket. Said he'd been on the Eldridge during the test. Wouldn't give his name. Said they'd been ordered not to talk, that there would be consequences if anyone found out. But he was scared. Needed to tell someone. Described the field activation, the green-blue light that surrounded the ship. The way the air seemed to crack and fold. He said it worked at first. Said the ship actually disappeared from view. But then something went wrong. The field became unstable. Some of the crew started hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. Others experienced time skipping forward in jumps, missing minutes. He said 2 men walked through a bulkhead without meaning to, just stepped forward and passed through solid steel like it wasn't there. When the field finally collapsed and they could see properly again, one of those men was embedded in the metal. They had to cut him out. He died screaming. The Navy called it a training accident, but it wasn't an accident. It was the field. The field did something to reality itself. The sailor said the surviving crew members were examined by Navy doctors who diagnosed them with disorientation, sensory confusion, temporary psychological breaks. But he said it was more than that. Said they'd gone somewhere else during the test, brought something back with them. Something that watched them. Something that followed them. He begged me not to tell anyone. Said if I cared about him, I'd forget we ever talked. Then he left. I never saw him again. If anyone ever asks, I'll say this conversation never happened. But I'm writing it here because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that we're not alone in the world. There are spaces between spaces, and the Navy opened a door to one of those spaces in October 1943. ASTI 2, the first cracks in the story. The coordinates from the envelope led Henry to the Delaware River, to a section of waterfront that had once been part of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The facility had been decommissioned decades ago, its functions transferred to other locations, its real estate carved up and sold off. What had been a vital military installation was now a patchwork of commercial developments, industrial parks, and empty lots waiting for the next round of redevelopment. But this particular stretch of waterfront was different. Henry noticed it as soon as he pulled up. On either side, development had marched forward aggressively. New condominiums, office buildings, warehouses. But here, a gap. A stretch of perhaps 200 yards that had been left completely untouched. Chain-link fence, rust-stained and sagging. Warning signs faded to illegibility. Beyond the fence, nothing but weeds and crumbling concrete and the slow reclamation of nature. It was the kind of gap that raised questions. Why hadn't this land been developed? Who owned it? Why was it sitting empty while valuable waterfront property elsewhere sold for premium prices? Henry had learned to notice gaps like this. They were the bureaucratic equivalent of redacted text in documents. Spaces where something should be but wasn't. Absences that drew attention by their very emptiness. He parked his car, grabbed his camera and found a spot where the fence had rusted through enough to slip past. The ground beyond was uneven, concrete broken and heaved by years of freeze-thaw cycles. Rebar jutted from the ground at angles. Old machinery parts lay half buried in dirt and vegetation. The coordinates led him to what had once been a pier. The structure itself was mostly gone. Wooden pilings rotted away to stumps, decking collapsed into the river. But the foundations remained. Massive concrete mooring points, built to last decades, maybe centuries. The kind of permanent infrastructure the military installed when they expected to use a facility for a very long time. Henry walked the length of what had been the pier, photographing everything, taking measurements, trying to reconstruct what the facility would have looked like in 1943, and that's when he saw the sign. It was mounted on one of the concrete mooring points, barely visible under decades of grime and corrosion, a metal plaque, the kind the military used for designation markers. Henry almost missed it. Would have missed it if the afternoon sun hadn't caught the metal at just the right angle. He scraped at the surface with his car keys, clearing away enough dirt to read the text. The lettering was still sharp, stamped deep into the metal. Restricted area, authorized personnel only, authorization code, Rainbow 1943. Henry's hands were shaking as he photographed the sign. Here it was. Physical evidence, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Project Rainbow hadn't been a filing error or a coincidental code name. It had been significant enough to designate an entire section of the naval shipyard. Significant enough to require specific authorization codes. Significant enough to restrict access, even during a war when security was paramount everywhere. He spent the next hour searching the area for anything else that might have survived. And what he found made his skin prickle despite the summer heat. Scorch marks on the concrete. Not fire damage, Not the kind of charring you'd expect from industrial accidents or wartime activity. These were different. Circular patterns, perfectly symmetrical, radiating out from a central point like someone had drawn them with a giant compass. The marks were deep, the concrete itself altered in ways that shouldn't be possible. Henry crouched down, ran his fingers over the scorched surface. The concrete felt smooth, almost glassy in places, like it had been melted and then rapidly cooled. The pattern repeated multiple times across the pier foundation, always the same circular shape, always radiating from a central point. He photographed the marks from multiple angles, measured their dimensions, collected samples of the affected concrete by chipping off small pieces and sealing them in evidence bags. Later, he'd have them analysed by a materials engineer at MIT who owed him a favour. The engineer's report would arrive 3 weeks later, and it would raise more questions than it answered. The concrete had been exposed to sustained temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the heat hadn't come from conventional sources. The damage pattern suggested electromagnetic heating, like what you'd see in an induction furnace, but on a massive scale and applied in precise circular patterns. "I've never seen anything like this," the engineer wrote in his analysis. "The precision required to create these patterns, the heat levels needed, the fact that it's focused in such specific areas while leaving surrounding concrete untouched. Whatever caused this, it wasn't conventional technology. At least not any conventional technology I'm aware of. And the really strange part? Based on the depth of heat penetration into the concrete, this happened all at once. Not over time, not from repeated exposure. Someone or something applied massive electromagnetic energy in a single event, and these marks are what remains." But Henry didn't have that analysis yet as he stood on the abandoned pier in the fading afternoon light. All he had were strange scorch marks and a growing certainty that something significant had happened here. Something that the official record had carefully avoided documenting. Back in the archives, Henry focused on the Eldridge's movements during October 1943. The official record said the ship had spent most of that month in New York, conducting trials and equipment installation at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Standard procedure for a newly commissioned vessel. Nothing unusual about that. But Henry had learned to look at not just what was recorded, but how it was recorded. And the transfer logs for that period had some interesting anomalies. Standard naval procedure required detailed manifests for any equipment transfer. What was being moved, why it was being moved, who authorised the transfer, where it came from, where it was going. The Navy was obsessive about documentation. Everything had to be tracked, verified, receipted. It was how the military prevented theft, ensured accountability, maintained the paper trail that bureaucracies required to function. But on October 26, 1943, there was an entry in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard transfer logs that violated all those standard procedures. Special equipment transfer to Brooklyn Naval Yard. Authorization code Rainbow. No manifest required. Classification level restricted. Transfer completion to be confirmed by receiving facility. No manifest required. That was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Equipment transfers without manifests were rare, reserved for highly classified material that couldn't be described in standard documentation. But the classification level being listed as restricted, rather than using standard designations like confidential, secret or top secret, was even stranger. Restricted suggested a compartmentalised program, something so sensitive that standard classification levels didn't apply. The transfer was logged as complete on October 29th, one day after the date on the envelope, one day after the alleged experiment. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Henry tried to find records of what had been transferred, who had authorised it, where the equipment had come from, where it had gone after arriving in Brooklyn. Every angle he pursued led to the same dead end. Missing files, redacted documents, transfer records that had been removed from archives with notes saying classified material relocated to secure storage, or simply file not found. It was a pattern he'd seen before, the bureaucratic equivalent of burning evidence, You couldn't make records disappear completely, that would be too obvious. But you could scatter them, classify them at different levels, move them to facilities with restricted access, essentially bury them so deep that finding all the pieces became effectively impossible. But sometimes pieces survived in unexpected places. Henry found one such piece in a budget report for the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard Research Division. It was routine financial documentation, the kind of mundane paperwork that got filed and forgotten because no one imagined it would ever be interesting. But buried in a list of consultant payments for the fall of 1943 was an entry that made Henry lean closer to the microfilm reader. Consultant Services, Civilian Mathematician, 3 days, October 25 through October 27, Philadelphia Facilities, Classification Restricted, Payment processed through ONR Special Projects account. The consultant's name was redacted, but the file reference number included initials, JVN John von Neumann. It had to be. How many civilian mathematicians with those initials would have been consulting for the Navy in October 1943? How many would have been working on projects classified at special restricted levels? John von Neumann was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, polymath. He'd worked on the Manhattan Project, contributed to quantum mechanics, pioneered game theory, helped develop the first programmable computers. If there had been a classified Navy project involving advanced physics and electromagnetic theory in 1943, von Neumann would have been exactly the kind of person they'd bring in as a consultant. And the dates: October 25th through 27th, 3 days that ended 1 day before the alleged experiment on October 28th. Von Neumann would have left Philadelphia just as the test was being prepared, having provided the mathematical framework, the theoretical foundation, whatever expertise the Navy needed to attempt something unprecedented. Henry tried to find more information about von Neumann's work for the Navy in 1943. Hit the same walls he'd hit with everything else related to Project Rainbow. Redacted files, missing records, vague references to classified consulting work with no details about what that work entailed. But he had the initials, he had the dates, he had evidence that one of the world's leading mathematicians had been in Philadelphia, working on a restricted project right before the alleged experiment. The pieces were starting to connect, not conclusively, not in a way that would convince skeptics, but enough to show a pattern, enough to suggest that something real had happened beneath the layers of denial and misdirection. Henry knew he needed more. Documents and dates were important, but they could be explained away. He needed witnesses. People who'd been there, who'd seen what happened, who could provide first-hand testimony that matched the documentary evidence. Finding those witnesses would prove to be the hardest part of the investigation, and the most disturbing. Act 3. What really happened in 1943. Finding witnesses to something that officially never happened was like trying to reconstruct a photograph that had been deliberately torn into pieces and scattered. Henry started with the Eldridge's crew manifest, the official list of officers and enlisted men who'd served on the ship during her commissioning and early operations. Most of them were dead. 70 years had passed. The youngest would be in their late 80s or early 90s now. Heart disease, cancer, accidents, the simple attrition of time. Henry cross-referenced the manifest with veteran death records, tracked down obituaries, built a database of who'd survived and where they might be found. Out of a crew of 215, he found 37 men still alive. He started calling, introduced himself as a journalist researching naval operations during World War II, asked if they'd be willing to talk about their service. Most conversations ended quickly. Not interested. Don't remember much. Too old for this. Click. Henry expected that. People got tired of talking about the war. Memories faded. Some wounds never healed enough to discuss casually with strangers, but some reactions were different, more pointed. As soon as Henry mentioned the Eldridge in October 1943, the conversation changed. I can't help you. I don't know anything about that. You should talk to the Navy if you have questions. Click. Those reactions were interesting. Not I don't remember, but I can't help you. Not forgetfulness, but unwillingness. Like they'd been told not to talk. like they were still following orders from 7 decades ago. Then Henry expanded his search. He started looking not just at Eldridge crew members, but at sailors who'd been stationed at the Philadelphia or Brooklyn naval yards during October 1943. Men who might have seen something, witnessed something, even if they hadn't been directly involved. That's how he found Edward Ryan. Ryan had served on the USS Engstrom, another destroyer escort that had been in Philadelphia for trials and equipment installation at the same time as the Eldridge. When Henry called, Ryan didn't hang up, didn't give an immediate refusal. Instead, there was a long silence after Henry mentioned the Eldridge's name. Finally Ryan spoke. His voice was quiet, careful. "I was wondering when someone would finally ask about that. Been carrying it for 70 years. Figured I'd die with it. Maybe that would be easier." "Would you be willing to meet in person?" Henry asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. Another pause. "Yes, but not over the phone, not where anyone will see us. I don't know if they still watch, but I'm not taking chances." They met 3 days later at Ryan's house in Rhode Island, a small ranch-style home near the coast. The walls were decorated with naval memorabilia, photos of ships, deployment certificates, shadow boxes containing medals and ribbons, the proud displays of a career sailor who'd served honourably and remembered that service with satisfaction. But there were no photos of the Engstrom. Henry noticed that. The ship Ryan had served on during the exact period they were about to discuss was absent from all the carefully curated displays. Ryan made coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Not palsy, not age-related tremor. The trembling of someone who was nervous, scared maybe, finally about to share something he'd kept secret for most of his life. They sat at his kitchen table. Henry set up his tape recorder, asked permission to record. Ryan nodded. "Might as well. If I'm going to do this, might as well do it properly." "Tell me about October 1943, Henry began. Ryan took a sip of coffee, stared out the window at the ocean, started talking. "We were docked at Philadelphia for equipment installation. The Engstrom was new, still getting fitted out, with all the gear we'd need for convoy duty. Radar, sonar, depth charges, all the standard stuff. We were scheduled to be there for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Routine work. The Eldridge was there too, further down the pier. She was newer than us, commissioned just a couple months earlier. I remember seeing her arrive because she had all this special equipment being installed. Big coils, massive generators, cables everywhere. They put up fencing around her berth, posted guards. That wasn't unusual. Lots of ships got special equipment back then. Classified stuff we weren't supposed to know about, so we didn't pay much attention." Ryan paused, his hands tightening around the coffee mug. "October 28th. Clear day, good weather. I was on deck that afternoon doing routine maintenance, checking ropes, inspecting fittings, the kind of busy work they give sailors when there's not enough real work to keep everyone occupied. That's when I heard it. This sound. Not an engine, not machinery. Something else. High-pitched, almost beyond hearing, but you could feel it more than hear it. Made my teeth hurt. Made my bones vibrate. I looked over at the Eldridge to see where it was coming from. The sound was coming from her, from those coils they'd installed. They were active, glowing slightly like they were heating up. And then there was light. Ryan stopped, took another sip of coffee. His hands were shaking harder now. "What kind of light?" Henry prompted gently. "Green-blue, like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Not like fire, not like electricity. Something else. It started as a shimmer around the ship, like heat waves on a summer day. But then it got thicker, more solid. Like fog, but not fog because you could see through it, but also couldn't see through it at the same time. The light wrapped around the Eldridge, covered her completely. And then..." Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then she wasn't there anymore. I don't mean she disappeared like magic. I mean 1 second I was looking at a destroyer escort, and the next second I was looking at empty water. The moorings were still there. The gangplanks were still there, leading to nothing. The fencing, the guards, the equipment on the dock, all of it still there. But no ship. I thought I was losing my mind. Looked around, saw other sailors on deck, saw the same confusion on their faces. We were all seeing it, all seeing nothing where a 300-foot warship should have been. How long was she gone? Henry asked. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Hard to say. Time felt wrong, stretched out. Then the light appeared again, and the ship came back, just materialised out of nothing, exactly where she'd been, like she'd never left. But something was different. Even from my ship I could see something was wrong. Men running on deck, officers shouting, and this sound, this screaming. Not scared screaming, not pain screaming. Something worse, like the sound someone makes when they've seen something that broke their understanding of reality. The guards rushed in, started clearing everyone away. Officers came running from the shipyard offices. We were ordered below deck immediately, told not to discuss what we'd seen, told it was a classified test and talking about it would be considered treason. Next day, the Eldridge was gone. Moved to Brooklyn, they said. Emergency transfer for additional equipment installation. And anyone who'd been on deck during the test, anyone who'd seen what happened, got called in for medical evaluation. Ryan pulled out an old folder, the kind veterans kept with their discharge papers and service records. Inside was a medical form, yellowed with age, dated October 31st, 1943. Henry read the diagnosis. Severe disorientation, sensory confusion, temporary vision disruption. Recommend observation for possible neurological effects from equipment malfunction exposure. Equipment malfunction, Ryan said bitterly. That's what they called it. An equipment malfunction that made a ship disappear. An equipment malfunction that scrambled the minds of everyone who saw it. They examined all of us. Physical exams, neurological tests, psychological evaluations. Asked the same questions over and over. What did you see? What do you remember? Are you experiencing headaches, nausea, disorientation? They had experts explain it to us. Scientists with charts and equations. Made it sound perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. Some kind of optical phenomenon created by the experimental equipment. A mass hallucination caused by electromagnetic interference with brain function. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that actually happened. But it wasn't an optical phenomenon. I know what I saw, and I know what happened to the other men who were there. 7 of us total from the Engstrom were on deck that afternoon. 3 of them had complete nervous breakdowns within a month, had to be medically discharged, spent time in naval psychiatric facilities. 2 more committed suicide before the war ended. The Navy said it was combat stress, coincidence, the normal toll of warfare. But I knew different. Those men were fine before the test. Strong, stable, good sailors. What they saw that day broke something in them. What about you? Henry asked quietly. How did you cope? Ryan was silent for a long moment. I started drinking, heavily. It took me years to stop. Even now, I have nightmares. Not about combat, not about anything else from the war. Just that green light. That impossible moment when reality stopped making sense. I wake up and I can still feel it. That wrongness. Like the world around me is just a thin shell over something vast and incomprehensible. What do you think happened? Henry asked. Honestly? Ryan looked him in the eye. I think they were trying to make the ship invisible to radar. Maybe to the naked eye too. I think they succeeded. And I think, whatever method they used had effects they didn't anticipate, didn't understand, couldn't control. That's what I think happened. They tore a hole in something. Opened a door that should have stayed closed, and they couldn't close it properly. Henry left Rhode Island with the tape recording, the medical document, and a list of names. Ryan had given him other sailors who'd been in Philadelphia that day, men who might still be alive, who might be willing to talk. The second witness Henry tracked down was Michael Torres. Unlike Ryan, Torres hadn't been in Philadelphia at all. He'd been stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, serving on a supply ship, 500 miles away from the alleged experiment. But Torres had his own story, and it matched the legend in ways that made Henry's hand shake as he took notes. They spoke over the phone. Torres lived in Arizona now, far from any ocean, far from anything that might remind him of his Navy service. He sounded wary when he answered, but something in Henry's questions made him decide to talk. October 28th, 1943, Torres began. We were loading cargo at the Norfolk docks. Standard supply run, nothing unusual. Around 2 in the afternoon, someone started shouting, pointing at the harbour. There was a ship there, just appeared. Didn't sail in, didn't come from anywhere we could see. It was just suddenly there in the middle of the harbour where no ship had been seconds before. I saw the hull number, D173, the USS Eldridge. I remember because one of our officers checked the fleet positions, got on the radio, started asking what the hell a destroyer escort was doing in Norfolk when she was supposed to be in Philadelphia. The ship looked wrong. That's the best way I can describe it. The outline was sharp, but somehow blurred at the same time, like looking at something through water or heat shimmer, and there was this green tint to the air around it, this glow that didn't come from any source I could identify. We watched it for maybe 10 minutes. Everyone on the dock stopped working, just stared. Then it vanished, same way it appeared, just gone like it had never been there. When our officer finally got through to Philadelphia Naval Yard, they confirmed the Eldridge was there, had been there all day, never left. But I saw it. We all saw it. A ship can't be in 2 places at once, unless something impossible happened. Henry pulled up the Navy cargo logs for Norfolk on October 28th. He'd checked them before, found nothing unusual in the official entries, but this time he looked more carefully at the handwritten notes in the margins, the unofficial comments that dock workers sometimes scribbled. One entry, logged at 1400 hours, right around the time Torres described. The official entry was routine, standard harbour operations, loading and unloading, nothing noteworthy. But in the margin, in barely legible handwriting, unexpected hull presence. Detected, approximate location Pier 7. No identification available. No record of scheduled arrival. Duration approximately 10 minutes. Phenomenon unexplained. Recommend further investigation. No ship name attached, but the timing matched perfectly. The location matched perfectly. And the language, unexpected hull presence, suggested radar or visual detection of something that shouldn't have been there. The Philadelphia experiment legend had always claimed the Eldridge disappeared from Philadelphia and reappeared in Norfolk. Henry had dismissed that as embellishment, the kind of detail that got added to stories over time, but here was evidence, not conclusive but compelling, that something matching that description had actually occurred. Henry found one more piece of evidence before moving to the next phase of his investigation, and it was the most disturbing thing he'd discovered yet. In a box of declassified documents from the Office of Naval Research Photographic Archives, buried among hundreds of unremarkable images, he found a photograph stamped with a classification level that had been downgraded to unclassified in 1990. The date on the stamp, October the 1943. The source, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The image was blurry, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed the deck of a ship, metal structures, equipment, and in the foreground, partially obscured by what might have been smoke or fog or some kind of distortion field, was something that looked disturbingly like a human shape. But the shape wasn't standing on the deck. It was embedded in the metal, fused into the steel plating. The outline was clear enough, arms extended, torso twisted, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Like someone had been walking forward when the metal suddenly became solid around them, trapping them permanently in the structure of the ship itself. Henry stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to find some other explanation. A trick of light and shadow, an artifact of the photographic process, anything other than what it appeared to be. He brought the image to the Navy archivist who'd been helping him access documents, showed it without comment, waited for a reaction. The archivist's face went pale. He looked at the file number, looked at Henry, looked back at the photograph. "This file was misfiled," he said quietly. "This shouldn't be in the declassified archives. It should never have been accessible to public research. You need to return it immediately." "What is it?" Henry asked. "What am I looking at?" The archivist wouldn't answer, just kept repeating that the file needed to be returned, that Henry hadn't seen it, that some things remained classified for very good reasons, and this was one of them. But Henry had already photographed it, already made copies, already secured the evidence in multiple locations so it couldn't simply disappear. He left the archives knowing he'd crossed a line. The investigation was no longer theoretical. He had witnesses, he had documents, he had physical evidence, and he had a photograph that suggested something truly horrific had happened aboard the USS Eldridge in October 1943. Now he needed to know what happened after, how the Navy had responded, what they'd done to contain the situation, and whether the experiment had truly ended, or if it had simply gone underground, hidden where no one would think to look. The answer to those questions would prove more disturbing than anything he'd discovered so far, to be continued in Part 2. The Men Who Didn't Return. Part 2. The Cover-Up Actee. 4. The Cover-Up. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Henry had been investigating government cover-ups long enough to recognise the fingerprints of institutional misdirection. It wasn't aggressive suppression, it wasn't men in black threatening witnesses or breaking into offices to steal files. That would be too obvious, too dramatic, too likely to draw attention. Instead, it was subtle, bureaucratic, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Documents that should exist but didn't. Files misfiled in ways that made them effectively impossible to locate. Witnesses who couldn't quite remember or weren't quite sure. Evidence that existed but couldn't be verified or authenticated through normal channels. The Philadelphia experiment wasn't buried under threats and intimidation. It was buried under confusion and plausible deniability. Henry noticed it first with the deck logs. He'd photographed the USS Eldridge's logs for October 1943, noted how sparse and vague they were compared to other months. But when he examined the physical documents more closely, comparing them to logs from September and November, he found something interesting. The paper was different. The September and November logs were written on standard Navy issue forms from 1943. Slightly yellowed, consistent aging, the paper quality matching other wartime documents. But the October logs used different paper, whiter, crisper, the kind of stock that came into use in the early 50s. The typewriter font was different too. September and November used one style, slightly faded, the letters showing the wear patterns of a machine that had seen heavy use. October used a different typewriter entirely, the letters sharper, more uniform, newer. Henry photographed the differences, brought them to a documents examiner he'd worked with on previous investigations. The examiner confirmed what Henry suspected. The October logs had been retyped sometime in the early 1950s, transferred from original documents onto new paper using a different typewriter. "Why would they do that?" the examiner asked. "To change the content," Henry said, "or to remove details that were in the originals. You retype the logs, include only what you want preserved, destroy the originals, and claim the new versions are the real record." He checked the archive transfer documents, found a notation that the original October 43 logs had been marked as damaged and illegible in January 1952. They'd been retyped for preservation purposes, and the originals had been listed as unable to locate in subsequent inventory checks. 9 years after the alleged experiment, someone had gone through the Eldridge's records and systematically replaced the October logs with sanitized versions. Not destroyed them completely, that would raise too many questions. Just retyped them, made them vaguer, removed whatever specific details had been in the originals. Then Henry found the memo. It was buried in the Office of Naval Research Files dated November 1955, just weeks after the sailor had stumbled into Betty's diner in Norfolk. The timing couldn't be coincidental. The memo was brief, marked for limited distribution to facility commanders and security officers. The subject line read, "Guidance regarding Project Rainbow inquiries." Recent unauthorized disclosures have resulted in increased public inquiry regarding historical Navy research programs, specifically those conducted under the Rainbow designation during World War II. Personnel are instructed to terminate all discussions of these programs and refer any questions to the Office of Naval Research Security Division for official response. No statements regarding Rainbow research should be made without prior approval from ONR Command. All documentation related to Rainbow programs remains classified and is not available for public review. Violations of these guidelines will be treated as unauthorized disclosure of classified information. terminate discussions, not answer questions, not clarify misunderstandings, not provide factual corrections. Terminate. That was interesting language for a project that supposedly never existed, or had been nothing more than routine degaussing research. Henry's investigation was starting to attract attention. He noticed it gradually, the way you notice the temperature dropping degree by degree. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested surveillance. A car that seemed to be parked near his apartment more often than random chance would explain. Same make and model, different license plates, but always someone sitting in the driver's seat reading a newspaper. Phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. Not wrong numbers, not telemarketers, just silence and the faint sound of someone breathing, listening. His hotel rooms in Washington showing signs of having been searched. Nothing dramatic, nothing stolen. Just small things out of place. Clothes folded slightly differently than he'd left them. Papers in his briefcase rearranged. His notebook moved from one side of the desk to the other. Henry wasn't paranoid. He'd dealt with government. Surveillance before, knew what it looked like, knew how to recognise when someone was keeping tabs on your activities. But this felt more focused than his previous experiences, more interested in what he was finding and who he was talking to. He started taking precautions, made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations, safety deposit boxes, trusted friends, lawyers' offices, varied his routines, took different routes to meetings, checked for tails before conducting interviews. Then Edward Ryan called. "I found something," Ryan said. His voice was excited, breathless. Was going through old papers from my service, stuff I hadn't looked at in decades. There's a letter from someone who was on the Eldridge. He wrote to me in '44, said he needed to tell someone what really happened. I'd forgotten about it completely, but it's here, and Henry, it confirms everything. "Can you send it to me?" Henry asked. "I'm going to make copies first, mail them to different addresses, just in case. I know it sounds paranoid, but after talking to you, after thinking about all this again, I don't want to take chances. Give me a couple of days to get everything organised and I'll call you back." Ryan never called back. 3 days later, Henry got a call from Ryan's daughter. Her father had died, heart attack in his sleep. He was 92 years old, had a history of heart disease, was on medication for high blood pressure. The doctors said it was natural causes, nothing suspicious, just an old man reaching the end of a long life. Henry felt something cold settle in his stomach. The timing, just days after Ryan had found something important, just days after he'd talked about making copies and sending them to safe locations. "I'm sorry for your loss," Henry said carefully. "Your father was a good man. He told me a lot about his service." "He enjoyed talking to you," Ryan's daughter said. "First time in years he'd really opened up about the war. He seemed lighter after your conversation, like he'd put down a burden he'd been carrying too long." They talked for a few more minutes. Arrangements, funeral details. Then, as they were about to hang up, Ryan's daughter mentioned something that made Henry's pulse quicken. Oh, there was something strange. 2 men came to the house the day after Dad died. Said they were from the Veterans Affairs Office, needed to collect his service records for processing. Very official, had ID badges and everything. But they didn't leave any paperwork, didn't give us any receipts, just took a box from Dad's study and left. Henry gripped the phone tighter. What did these men look like? "I don't know. Average, I guess. Dark suits. I can't really remember their faces. Is that weird? I saw them, talked to them, but I couldn't describe them if you asked me." The same description Betty Kowalski had given. The same impossibility of remembering details. Men designed to be forgotten. Did they take anything else, besides the box? "I'm not sure. Dad's study was kind of a mess. He'd been looking for something in there the day before he died, pulling out old folders and papers. I was going to help him clean it up after I finished work, but then he..." She trailed off. Henry attended the funeral, paid his respects, talked to Ryan's family, didn't mention his suspicions. But after the service, when everyone else had left, he sat in his car in the cemetery parking lot and thought about the timing. Ryan finds evidence. Ryan dies 3 days later. Men in suits arrive immediately and remove his papers. A 92-year-old man with heart disease dying suddenly is unremarkable, unless you knew what he'd been about to reveal. Unless you knew someone had a very strong interest in making sure that evidence never surfaced. Henry knew he was running out of time. The story was coming together, but it was also falling apart. Witnesses dying, documents disappearing, his own investigation increasingly compromised. He needed something definitive, something they couldn't disappear or explain away, something that would prove beyond doubt that the Philadelphia experiment had been real. He needed to find someone who'd been directly involved, someone on the inside, someone who knew exactly what had happened and could confirm the truth. That's when he found Arthur Calloway. Calloway wasn't listed on the Eldridge's crew manifest. According to Navy records, he'd served on a completely different ship, the USS El Dorado, and had been reported missing in action in 1944 during Mediterranean operations. His family had received a telegram, a flag, condolences from the Secretary of the Navy. But Henry found a discrepancy. It was small, easy to miss, the kind of thing that only emerged when you cross-referenced multiple document types. An insurance form filed by Calloway's family in 1946, trying to collect on a life insurance policy. The form listed his service history, including all ship assignments, and there, buried in the middle of the list, was a single line that didn't appear in any official Navy records. Temporary assignment USS Eldridge, special duty, October 1943. Special duty. That was Navy code for classified assignments. Operations that didn't appear on standard manifests. Henry had seen it before in other contexts. Men pulled from their regular posts for short-term assignments that needed specific expertise or security clearances. So Arthur Calloway had been assigned to the Eldridge in October 43 for special duty, and then he'd been listed as killed in action the following year. Except Arthur Calloway wasn't dead. Henry found him through a combination of bureaucratic archaeology and dumb luck. A death certificate that was filed but then withdrawn, a social security number that